Good evening, everyone. I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you fall asleep. So before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching this, so leave it in the comments. When you're ready, get comfortable and relax. The rain is relentless. It beats on the windshield of my car with such fury that it seems to want to shatter it, as if the storm itself is trying to rip me out of this world. I have been driving aimlessly for hours now, the empty road stretching out before me like a dark snake, writhing through the vast nothingness. My mind is in a constant state of alert, the storm amplifying every thought, every memory, as if the sound of water falling on metal is some kind of threat. I am alone, as I have always been since I left the force. Alone since I left that life that consumed me little by little, leaving me empty, purposeless, aimless. My name is Santiago. Though I strive to forget my past, it always finds a way to catch up with me, to drag me back into the abyss. The life I left behind haunts me, and no matter how hard I try to run away from it, its traces are marked on my skin, on my soul. My work as a private detective never stopped tormenting me. I spent years investigating cases of domestic violence, cases of women murdered by their husbands, boyfriends, lovers, men who believed they could possess women as if they were objects, and when those objects were broken, they discarded them as worthless. I saw too many tragedies, too many inevitable endings. And although I tried not to let it affect me, the truth is that I never learned to forget. Each case stayed with me, like a bloodstain that won't go away, and that dragged me here to this small, faraway town, where a strange call put me on the path of a new case. The call was brief, urgent, barely a raspy voice on the other end of the line. A man had murdered his wife and was now on the run, taking refuge in an abandoned house on the outskirts of town. Something about that information moved me. Something inside me was awakened, though I didn't know what it was. The scene was familiar, very familiar. It wasn't the first time I had heard about a similar murder, but there was something about this call that I couldn't ignore. Maybe it was the memory of all those broken lives, all those women who couldn't be saved. Or maybe I simply wanted something to pull me out of this abyss of loneliness and regret I found myself in. In any case, my mind did not hesitate for a second. I had to go. Evil could not go unpunished, and I had to be the one to put an end to this nightmare. The storm worsens as I get closer to the house. I turn on the car lights, but I can barely see more than a few yards because of the density of the rain. The trees on the sides of the road lean from the force of the wind, their branches rustling as if trying to warn me, as if they want to stop me. Nevertheless, I keep going. The house appears in the distance, a shadowy figure at the end of the dirt road. It is crumbling but still stands with an eerie presence, as if everything that happened inside those walls is still alive, waiting to be discovered. I stop the car and get out. The rain hits me like whips of icy water, drenching me instantly. The house looks even more sinister now that I'm close to it, and although common sense screams at me that I should turn around, something inside me pushes me to keep going. The air is heavy, thick, as if the place has absorbed the suffering of all those who once lived there. The icy wind seems to penetrate to the bone, and the feeling of being watched does not leave me for a second. But there is no turning back. The front door is ajar, and without thinking too much, I cautiously push it open. The creaking of the wood announces to me that something in this place has been long forgotten. An icy wind escapes from the darkness inside the house, like a whisper of warning. But I don't stop. I take a breath and go inside. The interior is even gloomier. The silence is absolute, broken only by the rumbling of the storm outside. The house is in ruins, furniture broken and strewn across the floor, as if the lives of those who lived here have crumbled along with the walls. The windows are broken, and the walls, covered in moisture, seem to breathe, as if the house itself is alive, waiting for someone to step inside to reveal its truth. My flashlight fleetingly illuminates the walls and floor, revealing damp stains spreading everywhere. The feeling of being watched grows, intensifying with each step I take. I feel on alert, as if someone is lurking in the shadows. I advance down the dark corridor. The air becomes heavier, thicker, and although I try to remain calm, I feel a pressure in my chest that makes me breathe with difficulty. There is something in the atmosphere, a tension, that does not allow me to relax. Every sound, no matter how small, makes me jump in place. Finally, I reach the back room. The door is closed, and something inside me tells me that what I'm looking for is there. Something pushes me to open it. I do so cautiously, my breathing quickening. The darkness inside the room is absolute, but the light from my flashlight, moving, reveals what is on the floor. It is a woman. Her body lies on the floor, surrounded by a pool of blood. Her face, though inert, looks familiar. I don't know how, but something in her expression pierces me. It's not the first corpse I've seen, nor the first I've investigated, but each of those faces sticks in my mind. The scene is disturbing, too clean, almost clinically calculated. There was no struggle, no fight. The body is lying there as if the killer had acted with absolute coldness. It was not a fit of rage, not a moment of blind fury. This murder was meticulously planned, executed with a precision that leaves no room for doubt. The man who did this knew what he was doing. My mind begins to analyze every detail. The position of the body, the footprints on the ground, the absence of signs of a struggle. Everything points to the same thing. This was no mistake. This man, the killer, had waited for the perfect moment, had planned every step. As my thoughts cross and my heart pounds, a new sensation hits me. The air thickens, the pressure builds, and suddenly I realize I'm not alone. A sudden movement behind me makes me turn instinctively. My body reacts before my mind, and instantly I realize he is there, the man I was looking for. I didn't hear him come in. I don't know how he did it, but he's right in front of me. He doesn't speak. He doesn't move. He just stands there, silent. The flashlight illuminates his face intermittently, but the light barely reveals shadows, thick lines of sweat and despair. Time seems to stand still. The tension is palpable, and my body tenses, ready for whatever comes. I know he is waiting for something. He is waiting for me to make a mistake. My experience tells me that this man is not running away. He is not escaping. No, he's here because he wants to face something. Me. And doubt looms in my mind. What to do now? I know there is no turning back. There is no time to think about what comes next. I can only rely on my training, on my ability to analyze the situation. He's in control, I know, but I have something he doesn't. Years of experience, years of confronting the darkness of the human mind. The rain keeps pounding on the roof of the house. The sound seems to envelop us, as if the storm itself is taking part in this confrontation. The distance between us is minimal, but neither of us takes the first step. We watch each other in silence, knowing that each of us is waiting for something from the other. Suddenly, a metallic sound breaks the silence. The man drops a blade to the ground. The echo of the metal reverberating in the room is the only sound that breaks the tension. Without saying a word, without making a single movement, he begins to walk away into the shadows of the house. It does not follow me. It doesn't attack me. It just disappears, like a shadow dissolving into the darkness. What I discovered that night was not the truth about the killer, but something far more disturbing. Evil doesn't always have a face. Sometimes evil is just a manifestation of desperation, a need for control over something or someone. True evil is not always monstrous. Sometimes it is hidden in everyday gestures, in the decisions of an ordinary person, in an ordinary man, desperate and broken. And though the storm is still raging outside, I now understand that the darkness is inside all of us. The line between good and evil is thinner than we imagine, and perhaps we will never be able to see clearly where one ends and the other begins. But what I do know is this: no matter what we do, the storm never stops raging. My name is Angel, and I am a salsa musician. Music has been my companion for as long as I can remember. Melodies flow in me like a constant river, often improvising, letting the notes intertwine in a dance that only the soul can understand. Over the years, I have lived surrounded by chords and silences, in a world where time seems to stand still when I am in front of my instruments. The lonely afternoons in my studio and the rainy nights that inspired me so much were my only friends. But what happened that night, in the middle of a storm that seemed imbued with a dark force, would change my life forever. A few weeks ago, the need for something different began to take hold of me. The routine of my music had begun to drain my inspiration. I knew I had to find something else, something deeper, something that would push me into unknown territory, something that would take me out of my comfort zone and take me beyond the familiar melodies. What I was looking for was not just a new song. but an experience that would make me feel alive in every sense, that would give me back the creative impulse I had lost. The rain, always a constant in my life, became the perfect refuge for my thoughts. There was something about it, a kind of wet embrace that allowed me to escape from reality and enter a state of mind where creativity flowed freely. That night, the sky was darker than usual and the storm was raging. The thunder rumbled with such intensity that it seemed to pierce the air, as if nature was enraged. But instead of seeking shelter, something inside me urged me to go outside. I needed to walk in the rain, to lose myself in that liquid immensity that seemed to devour everything in its path. I wanted the storm to push my mind into the unknown, into something that would awaken a spark within me. I drove along a lonely road, far from the city, where the horizon was lost in the gloom. The streetlights didn't reach there, and the only beacon of light was that of my car, which drove forward through the darkness, illuminating the wet road. As I drove on, my mind kept turning over a melody I had begun to compose, an improvisation that sounded promising, but the storm derailed it again and again. I felt uneasy, as if something was about to happen, something that went beyond simple rain. It was a vague but present feeling, as if the whole universe was conspiring against me. It was then, as I came around a sharp bend, that I saw it. A black briefcase, abandoned in the middle of the road. The rain was lashing mercilessly, the wind was blowing hard, but the briefcase remained there, motionless, as if defying the storm. At first I thought it might be a joke, something left by some traveler who had forgotten his belongings. But something inside me stopped me. A very intense need to know more, to understand what that presence in the middle of nowhere meant. I could not ignore it. Something in my being urged me to investigate, to get closer. I stopped the car in the middle of the road. I got out cautiously and my heart began to beat strongly, as if the air itself was charged with a strange energy. With each step I took towards the briefcase, the sound of the rain increased, a deafening roar that seemed to come from every corner. The feeling that something wasn't right came over me, but my curiosity was stronger. My eyes were riveted on the briefcase, which now seemed to have an inexplicable power over me. My every move felt like an irreversible decision. When I arrived next to the briefcase, the first thing I noticed was that the lock was not completely closed. It was forced, slightly open, as if someone had tried to close it in a hurry without success. The briefcase emitted a kind of vibration in the air, a subtle pressure that made me feel uncomfortable. Something about its presence was unnatural. I felt an urgent need to leave it there, to ignore it. But instead, my trembling hand reached for the lid. I opened the case with a low creak, and that's when I saw it. Not what I expected, but something far more disturbing. Inside the briefcase, there was no money, no jewelry, no important documents. There was something much stranger, a small, intricately designed metal box that I didn't recognize. Its surface was marked by symbols that I could not identify, but which somehow seemed familiar. The case also contained a crumpled piece of paper, folded tightly. As I picked it up, I felt a pang in my stomach, a sense that something had changed forever. But the worst thing was not what I was seeing, but what I felt. A pressure, a threat that enveloped me completely. I unfolded the paper, and the first thing I noticed was the red ink. It was no ordinary ink. It was thick, almost viscous, and it still seemed wet. The written message read, "Don't look back, he is near, he is looking for you." A shiver ran down my spine. I didn't understand what it meant, but something inside me told me I had made a mistake, an irreversible one. In that moment, I knew I had touched something I shouldn't have, something that wasn't meant for me. The air seemed charged with a palpable tension, as if someone was watching me, lurking from the darkness. With the briefcase in my hands, I climbed into the car and started quickly. I felt as if the whole universe had changed, as if, by opening that briefcase, I had released a force I could not control. The storm continued, but now I felt isolated, trapped in a spiral I didn't understand. My mind kept spinning around the message, but worst of all was the feeling that there was something much bigger, something that was looking for me, something that I had unleashed by touching that briefcase. On the way back, the atmosphere felt strange. The rain seemed heavier, the thunder closer. Suddenly I saw a figure in the distance, near a bend. At first I thought it was a play of light or shadow, but as I got closer I could make it out clearly. It was a man standing in the middle of the road. He wasn't moving. He didn't seem to be seeking shelter, and his posture was strange, rigid, as if he was waiting for something. Something inside me told me that I shouldn't approach him, that I shouldn't look at him, but at the same time an inexplicable force was pulling me towards him. I accelerated the car, the sound of the tires echoing on the wet asphalt, and I looked ahead, not daring to look back. The feeling of being chased came over me. I knew something wasn't right, that this man was not just a coincidence, but part of something much darker, something that had started with the briefcase and that I could no longer stop. When I arrived at my apartment, I was completely overwhelmed. The briefcase was on the passenger seat, and I left it on the living room table, not wanting to look at it again. But something inside me told me that the briefcase was not meant to stay there. There was something else I didn't understand, something dark that had been unleashed. Paranoia began to invade me. Shadows lengthened in every corner of my apartment, and the feeling of being watched never left me. That night I could not sleep. The noises in the building seemed strange to me, distorted as if someone was walking the halls. I felt that something was stalking me, something that had started long before I opened that briefcase. Anxiety gripped me and paranoia became my only companion. I knew that what I had started had no turning back, and that at some point, that same feeling of being haunted would be someone else's reality. The following days were even stranger. I received unexpected visitors, people I didn't recognize, and the feeling of being watched intensified. Something told me I was trapped in a story I couldn't control, a story that hadn't started with me, but had somehow dragged me in. I felt like a piece in a game I didn't understand. Now, looking back on those days, I can say that what really haunts me is not the briefcase or the message. What haunts me is knowing that everything that happened started without my knowing it. I knew that the story I had unleashed would not end with me. My only consolation is that at some point someone will take my place and that person will be dragged into this same spiral, without knowing how or why. History will repeat itself and there will be no way to stop it. The reflection I am left with is simple. There are moments when our curiosity drags us to make decisions that we cannot undo. It leads us down dark paths, to decisions that do not understand the repercussions. But the scariest thing is not what we see nor what we understand. The scariest thing is what we don't want to see, what we don't understand, what keeps lurking, waiting for the right moment to take what belongs to us. The rain was falling furiously that night, hammering the roof of my cab as if the sky in its desperation was trying to erase some secret that should not be revealed. The sound, deafening, merged with the whisper of the wind and the constant vibration of the vehicle, creating an oppressive atmosphere, almost as dense as the fog that seemed to swallow the streets. For years, my life had been a succession of endless journeys, of unknown faces and uncertain destinations. Each passenger was just a passing shadow, someone who climbed into the cab to disappear with the next turn of the wheel. But that night, the rules of the game changed. I had been driving for more than 2 decades, picking up travelers from all walks of life, men and women exhausted by their routines, stray tourists looking for direction, and others who simply wanted to escape themselves for a few minutes. My life had acquired a monotonous rhythm, an existence marked by the constant murmur of the engine and the crunching of tires on wet asphalt. There was no room for surprises, no room for questions. But that night, that storm, that figure that climbed into the back seat of my cab, changed everything irreversibly. It was a dark night, one of those nights when the lights of the street lamps barely fought against the blackness of the sky. The rain, relentless, made the streets deserted. My car radio emitted a static, intermittent signal, like a distant whisper that made my nerves stand on edge. I passed by several empty streets thinking that tonight would be just another night like so many others. But then I saw him, a silhouette at the edge of the road, upright, rigid, as if waiting for something. The figure didn't look human in the conventional sense. Its posture was strange, unusual. It was not a simple pedestrian. Something about his presence made me uncomfortable. There were no other cars, no other pedestrians, just him, standing in the middle of the storm. I didn't think twice and slowed down the cab. Instantly he raised his hand and the feeling that something was about to happen came over me. There was no way to avoid it. I knew I had to stop. I stood there, watching, waiting. The figure advanced towards the car with a firm step, as if there was no hurry, as if time was suspended just for him. As he approached, I couldn't see his face right away, just a shadow, a blurry outline under the water sliding down his coat. The door opened with a low, almost imperceptible sound. The man climbed into the back seat without a word. His presence filled the space of the vehicle immediately, and a shiver ran down my spine. Something was not right. I started the car without a word, heading through the empty streets, still not knowing where to go. The sound of rain falling on the windshield was quite loud. I looked in the rearview mirror, but the man remained there, motionless, almost like a shadow. His hair, soaking wet, fell over his face, but his eyes were not looking at me. There was no indication that he saw me, but I felt his gaze fixed on something somewhere beyond the fogged windows of the car. Several minutes passed without him moving. The silence between us was overwhelming. He didn't utter a word, and I didn't know how to break the emptiness. I thought about asking, about saying something, about asking him for directions, but something inside me told me I shouldn't do it. I didn't want to know anything about him, or his intentions. I didn't want to get any more involved than I already was. But as time went on, something about his presence made me more and more uncomfortable, as if he was waiting for me to do something, for me to say something, as if he was watching me more than I wanted him to. Suddenly I realized that he hadn't given me an address. The radio emitted a strange buzzing sound, a signal that made me feel uneasy, as if someone was trying to tune into a frequency I wasn't supposed to be on. What did this man want from me? Why wasn't he talking? Why was all he was doing was waiting, waiting and waiting? The rain was pounding hard on the roof of the cab, and I couldn't stop watching the rearview mirror. Every moment, the man stood there motionless, but something in his breathing, in the way his body was tense, told me he was not as calm as he seemed. He was waiting for something. Cold sweat began to dampen my forehead, and my heart quickened its pace. Why did I feel this way? What was it about this man that made me so afraid? In a moment, without warning, the man moved his hand. It was a slow, calculated, but clear gesture. He pointed to the street on our right. He didn't say a word, but the movement of his arm, so precise, so controlled, was like an order. Something inside me was screaming at me to turn the steering wheel in the opposite direction, but I couldn't do it. My body was not reacting. The car obeyed, and soon I took the turn, entering an area of the city I didn't know well. The streetlights were beginning to fade, and the rain made everything around me blurry and distant. The road began to narrow, and suddenly we were on a dark, lonely dirt road. Something inside me said I should stop, that I shouldn't go any further, but instinct was not enough. The feeling that something much bigger than the storm was stalking us was growing by the second. My mind wanted to scream, wanted to escape, but my hands couldn't let go of the steering wheel. I was trapped, and I knew it. The man moved again, this time decisively. He leaned forward, slowly rolled down the window, and I knew what that meant. In that instant, an indescribable sense of dread came over me. Whatever was happening, I couldn't stop it. Something much bigger than me was in control, and I was just a spectator, one more piece in this strange game of which I didn't understand the rules. Then the radio suddenly went dead, and a sound began to make itself present. First faint, then clearer. Footsteps. Slowly, the footsteps came closer, as if someone else was advancing along the same road, following the same path. There were no vehicles, no witnesses, just us, the man and I, and the storm that enveloped us. The figure in the back seat finally broke his silence with a sigh, deep, as if he had released a huge weight. Then he leaned back, and his eyes met mine in the rearview mirror. A shiver ran down my spine. At that moment, I understood that I was not alone. Not just in the physical sense, but in the deeper, more terrifying sense. I was being watched by something that was not human. Its presence was so palpable that it was hard to breathe. I could not escape. I could not stop. Every kilometer I went, the feeling of being trapped intensified. The road disappeared little by little, and all that remained was the darkness and the storm. I felt despair engulf me. There was something much bigger than the storm, something lurking in the shadows, something I couldn't comprehend, but it was pulling me towards it. The abyss at the end of the road was not only geographical, but existential. There was no way out, and before I could react, the car came to an end. In front of me, emptiness. The road vanished into the abyss. The last thing I remember before everything went dark was a smile. It was not a smile of satisfaction, nor of accomplishment. It was an empty, cruel smile, as if it had all been part of a game from which I could never escape. Then the world shut down. I woke up in a hospital not knowing how I had gotten there. My body was covered in bruises, my mind in a daze, but the worst was what was missing. There was no trace of the man, no trace of his presence. The police only found traces of rain on the ground, nothing else. My car was empty and I unable to comprehend what had happened. Even today, the image of that smile haunts me, and I wonder if what I experienced was real or just a product of my mind exhausted by years of work and loneliness. But one thing is certain. I will never forget that feeling of being trapped, of having no escape, of being part of something much bigger and darker. And the next time someone gets into my car when the rain hits hard, I will always remember that not all passengers are what they seem. I'm Carlos. My life was never like the one I imagined when I was young, though perhaps on some level I always knew it would end here. In this lighthouse on a desolate islet surrounded by the fury of the ocean and the most absolute solitude. Here, in this secluded corner of the world, I have lived for years, forgotten about everyone and everything except my thoughts, which now seem to be the only company I have left. Sometimes I wonder if I really chose this fate, or if it was simply the result of a series of decisions that, like a river, dragged me to this point without my being able or knowing how to stop. The last time I saw a person, I can't remember it clearly. It has taken me so long to adjust to the loneliness that now I am no longer sure how much time I have spent here. Time is diluted in the routine of the days, the waves, the wind. The lighthouse, once a symbol of hope for lost sailors, is now my prison, my only refuge. My only interactions with the outside world are a dilapidated radio, the weekly shipments of groceries left at the dock, and the shadows of ships that appear on the horizon from time to time, as distant as my hope for a normal life again. The boats never come close. They never have reason to stop. And I, lost on this islet, go on with my life day after day without knowing if I do it out of pure habit or if I still hope for something. Maybe I even wait for the storm, because somehow it always seems like the end is near, with each of those gales that tear the ocean apart. Tonight's storm is different, no doubt. The wind has picked up with enormous force. The sea crashes against the rocks so violently that it makes me think the whole ocean could swallow the lighthouse in one blow. This is no ordinary storm. It's as if something is about to happen, as if the universe is setting the stage for some inevitable event. And I, despite being a rational man, a man who believes in logic and science, can't shake the feeling that this storm has a purpose beyond the natural. It has now been over an hour since it began, and the wind howls with a fury that seems to come from the bowels of the ocean. The rain hits the roof with such force that at times it seems as if the entire lighthouse is going to collapse. However, amidst the deafening noise of the storm, something begins to emerge that I cannot ignore. A murmur. At first, I thought it was just the storm playing with the lighthouse structures, or perhaps the sound of the wind filtering through the cracks, but the murmur has morphed into something else. Something I can't identify. Every time the wind drops a little, between the thunder and the creaking of the timbers, I hear footsteps. They are soft, shuffling, as if someone were climbing the stairs to the lighthouse. My eyes roam the lengthening shadows on the walls, but there is no one there. There is no reason for there to be anyone else in the lighthouse. It's a night like any other, isn't it? I haven't run into anyone in weeks, and the small boat dropping off groceries has brought nothing but supplies, never people. My mind begins to whirl, searching for a logical explanation, but all I find is a growing sense of discomfort. The footsteps continue, slowly, almost imperceptible but present, as if someone were climbing with the same slowness with which the sea creeps against the rocks. The sound intensifies and my heart begins to beat harder. I rise from my chair, my muscles tense, my breath cold as if the air has changed temperature. There are no lights on upstairs, nothing that could justify anyone's presence here. Despite my rational thoughts, my body moves by instinct. I climb the stairs, the sound of my footsteps almost inaudible compared to the creaking of the wood beneath my feet. When I reach the last step, the door leading to the upper room is closed, as always. I open it cautiously, half expecting something to surprise me on the other side. And it does. But not what I expected. The room is empty, at least to the naked eye. Everything seems to be in place, the machinery powering the beacon light, the old lamps flickering intermittently. But there is something that stops me. A trace. A few drops of fresh blood falling from the doorway. A few small red stains that creep into the center of the room. I follow the trail with my eyes, unease growing in my chest. The blood seems to be coming from somewhere in the corner, and my heart races as I take step after step. At first, my mind searches for a logical explanation, some physical cause for what I'm seeing. Maybe an injured animal, an accident, something natural. But I can't ignore what follows. In the corner of the room, an object crawls slowly across the floor. The flickering light of the lamp illuminates it briefly, and it is at that moment that I see it. A body. It is a man, or what's left of him. His skin pale, his face fallen to one side, the empty eyes staring into infinity, while the rest of his body is motionless as if waiting for something to happen. The corpse is covered by a gray blanket, but as I lift it, I find something else. A message. A message written in blood, in thick, desperate strokes, as if someone had tried to communicate something before dying. The words are clear, yet crooked. Don't do it. They are coming for you. At that moment, something in my mind clicks, and the truth hits me like a bolt of lightning. There's no way I'm the only one here. The storm, the blood, the corpse, the message. It's all been here long before I came into this room. The feeling of oppression, that presence I've felt for weeks, is not a figment of my imagination. There is something else in this lighthouse, something I don't want to understand, but it's already happening. The storm intensifies. The wind seems to tear at the walls of the lighthouse, and the rain falls like an unstoppable torrent. The pressure in my chest increases, and the darkness hangs over me like a heavy blanket. In those moments when the storm briefly subsides, I can hear the echoes. They are not the echoes of the wind or the sea. They are other echoes, deeper, darker. They are voices. I don't know if they come from inside the lighthouse or from somewhere beyond it, but I know I am not alone. The shadows on the walls seem to take on a life of their own. They lengthen and move as if they are searching for something hiding in the darkness, and suddenly it dawns on me. The lighthouse was never a shelter. It was always a prison. I have been trapped here, surrounded by what I feared most, what I always tried to avoid. The echoes, the whispers, the presences that I thought were simply inventions of my mind, now materialize in front of me with a force I cannot deny. The temperature drops sharply, and the air becomes dense, heavy, as if everything is pressing against me. The lighthouse trembles. The walls vibrate. And in that moment, the truth is undeniable. The footsteps I heard during the storm were not just mine. The message in blood was already here, long before I arrived. They have been here all along, watching me, waiting. Fear grips me, but I know there is no way out. The lighthouse is not a refuge. It never was. And the storm, which seems endless, is only the beginning. I don't know if it will ever calm down, or if this will be the lighthouse's last gasp before it is swallowed by the ocean. But one thing is certain. I was never alone. They were always here, waiting. And now, finally, they have come for me. Human beings, in their lonely existence, can find refuge in their surroundings. However, there are times when that refuge becomes the prison we feared. The storm can be the metaphor for the fears we drag inside, those that haunt us incessantly, no matter where we escape to. Sometimes it is the human mind itself that builds the walls that limit us. And when we cannot see beyond, when we dare not look at what we have in front of us, the greatest danger lies in ignoring what we are capable of doing, to ourselves and to others. It was a dark and rainy night, one of those when the storm seems to have no end. The raindrops were hitting the window glass hard as if they were trying to break through it, and the wind, fierce and uncontrolled, made the world barely recognizable, distorted and gloomy. The thick fog, a product of the cold and humidity, crept through the trees, giving the landscape a ghostly atmosphere. I was alone, as always in my photographic excursions. My name is Franco, and nature is my only company. Or at least that's what I thought until that night. It was not the first time I ventured into extreme conditions. Storms, wind, and rain did not scare me. On the contrary, they offered me a unique opportunity to capture unusual images, those that revealed a hidden world, something out of the ordinary. This time, however, the storm was overtaking me. The rain had begun to fall hours before, and it didn't seem ready to stop. Visibility was minimal, the darkness was all-encompassing, and the sound of the wind, combined with the constant noise of the drops, drowned out any other sound. Through the blizzard, the shadows of the trees moved as if they were ghosts, slipping through the chaos of the storm. A sea of silhouettes caught between water and wind. In spite of everything, the feeling that there was something beyond the visible, the obvious, continued to haunt my thoughts. There was something calling me, something that compelled me to go deeper into the forest. I decided to continue on my way into the forest. I didn't know what exactly I was looking for, but the camera in my hands, as always, was ready to capture that something that always seemed to be just out of reach. That obsession that some of us know all too well. The constant search for the unattainable. Not far away, a figure materialized in front of my eyes, barely visible in the shadows. At first, I thought it was an illusion, a distortion caused by the rain, but as it got closer, I could make out more details. It was a man, or so it seemed. His silhouette was tall and thin, his face hidden by a wide-brimmed hat that barely let me see his features. His body moved with an almost mechanical precision, as if each step was perfectly calculated without a hint of hesitation or hesitation. Despite the strangeness of the figure, I did not experience fear at first. My mind was too focused on the photographic opportunity the scene offered me. I thought it was all just a coincidence in the middle of the storm. But I soon realized that I was not alone in this, that figure was just one more in a group of shadows that moved with the same precision, intertwining in the landscape as if they were part of the same entity. Each of those men, if they were, seemed to share a disconcerting synchronization, an orchestrated movement that was not normal. As if they had a mission, a common purpose. Something inside me told me that I should leave, that it was not safe to stay there. It was not fear that drove me, but a palpable sense of discomfort. I couldn't explain it, but something didn't fit. With my heart racing, I tried to discreetly turn away, seeking to return to the spot where I had left my equipment. But as I did so, I began to notice that the figures were following me, not directly, but like lurking shadows, slipping through the trees, almost invisible, but always present, always close. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Was it fear? Was it my mind playing tricks on me because of the loneliness and the storm? But no. Something told me it wasn't a mere hallucination. Something in their movements, in the way they seemed to move unseen, made me think it wasn't a fluke. Something else was going on there. Suddenly, as I hurried back, I stumbled over something. The rain was so heavy that I could barely see the ground. But as I felt what had fallen, I realized it was a hat, the same kind of hat worn by the man I had observed. As I picked it up, a strange sensation came over me. The fabric of the hat was soaked, but it wasn't just water covering it. Something else, something strange, seemed to permeate the fabric, as if the moisture wasn't the only culprit for that slimy feeling. The material of the hat had a strange texture, a touch that I couldn't identify. Something wasn't right. Then a shadow moved behind a nearby tree. My heart began to pound. I was no longer alone. Something was approaching, and it was no longer just a vague sense of unease. I could feel it clearly. Someone or something was watching me, stalking me. The footsteps, the rustling of branches under the weight of something slipping through the trees became more and more evident. They were not people sheltering from the storm. They were something else, something much more disturbing. And their presence was not casual. They knew what they were doing. They were looking for me. The rain seemed to intensify even more, but the strange thing was that as the sound of the water fell relentlessly over the landscape, everything became sharper. I could hear the sound of their breaths, deep and unhurried, and the way they moved through the trees with a synchronization that bordered on the supernatural. There was no hesitation in their steps. There was no fear, just an eerie stillness. Something told me that I could not trust the shelter of the trees, that those around me were not there by chance. There was something much darker behind their presence, something I could not understand. Fear began to take hold of me, and it was then that I saw their faces. In the gloom, between the shadows and the rain, I could distinguish them more clearly. Their eyes, empty, lifeless. There was no emotion in them, no humanity. They were cold, expressionless eyes, as if the souls of those beings had been torn out. The faces lacked all vitality, as if there was nothing left of what they once were. They were no ordinary people. They were something different. something that did not belong to this world. My body reacted before my mind. I ran without thinking, without looking back. It no longer mattered which direction I ran. Nothing else mattered but running away. But it didn't matter how fast I ran, it didn't matter how far I moved. I knew I was being followed. The storm blinded me and my steps became erratic, frantic, as fear drove me to keep running. My legs no longer responded. The cold of the rain was bone-chilling and fatigue was beginning to take over my body. I knew I could not escape much longer. A flash of lightning lit up the sky in an instant, and in that split second, I saw what I feared most. It wasn't just the empty eyes that terrified me. It wasn't just their appearance that chilled my blood. In the gloom, among the shadows creeping through the storm, I could make out symbols. Strange markings, incisions on their bodies, symbols that suggested a belonging to something much bigger, something much darker. A cult. A secret cult. The idea seized my mind with the force of a revelation, and I knew I had been a fool. A fool to believe that nature was a mere backdrop for my photographs, not understanding that something much darker lurked within it. The shadows were getting closer and closer, and it wasn't just a curiosity chase. No. There was something much deeper, something darker, moving them. The storm was not there to hide their movements. The storm was part of their plan, part of their game. My camera, that tool that had accompanied me on so many adventures, fell from my hands without my being able to help it. It no longer mattered. I no longer cared about the photograph or the perfect image I had been chasing for so long. I only cared about escaping. I only cared about getting out of that place before it was too late. Finally, when I could run no more, when my body gave up completely, I stopped. I was exhausted. The storm would not let up. The wind, the cold, and the rain enveloped me, but the only thing I could hear were my own gasps, choppy with fear and despair. I looked up at the dark sky as if waiting for the storm to offer me an answer, but there was no consolation. It was too late. Everything faded into darkness. The next day, when the storm finally ceased, I found my camera a few feet from where it had fallen. But the image I had captured before I lost it, I will never forget. What I saw in the viewfinder was not what I expected. It was not the lone figure I had thought I had seen. It was not a man, not an isolated presence. What I saw, what I captured, was a group, and not just a group of people. They were disfigured figures, human shadows gathered in what appeared to be a dark ritual, a sacrifice. And at the center of that scene was me. That morning, I understood something I never imagined. There are no safe places. There are no hidden corners where darkness cannot reach you. Human beings are capable of much more terrifying things than any monster or spirit, because human shadows, the ones that surround us, sometimes have more power than we think. And the real darkness, the most terrifying darkness, lies deep within the human mind. The rain, as always, never stopped. And as it poured down on the world, only one question remained in my mind. Who was behind the camera in that last photo? And so, in my lonely search for perfect images, I discovered something much more terrifying, the truth behind the human face. I am a writer of surreal suspense stories, a hunter of emotions who feeds on the shadows of the unknown. My life has been a constant journey through the darkest corners of the human mind, searching for something to challenge me, to make me feel, to shake me to my bones. I am no ordinary writer. I do not seek simply to tell a story, but to immerse the reader in a visceral state, to make him tremble with every word, with every unexpected twist. And to achieve this, I must face the unknown, walk on the edge of the rational and the irrational. It was on a stormy night, when a furious deluge was pounding violently on the ground, that I decided to enter a forgotten forest on the edge of civilization. The rain was falling with overwhelming intensity, as if the sky itself was weeping tears of despair upon the earth. The sound of thunder rumbled in the distance, creating a symphony of chaos and fear that enveloped everything around me. Through the water overflowing in puddles and streams, my footsteps echoed on the sodden earth as I advanced through the twisted, moss-covered trees. Each shadow seemed to take on a life of its own, dancing around me with a latent malice. I knew that something sinister dwelled in the depths of that forest, something that had remained hidden for centuries. It was not the first time I had ventured into nature in search of inspiration. I had always felt an inexplicable attraction for dark and isolated places, for those spaces that seemed forgotten by mankind. There, where time seemed to have stopped, where civilization left no trace but oblivion, was where I found the essence of the stories that haunted me. But this time, something was different. Something in the air told me that I should not continue, that this forest was not just another stage but a living being, aware of my presence, ready to challenge me in ways I could not foresee. With each step I took, the atmosphere became denser, more oppressive. The trees, tall and stout, seemed to close in around me, as if trying to trap what little light filtered through the dark clouds. The wind, furious, stirred the leaves and branches with an almost human violence, whispering warnings that my mind refused to hear. I knew that such places were steeped in stories and legends, in that which was hidden beneath the cloak of reality. Sometimes those stories took shape, and what seemed to be just a manifestation of imagination turned out to be something much more real. That's when I saw it. A dark, hooded figure moving through the trees with unearthly grace. My heart stopped in my chest as I realized that I was not alone in that cursed place. It was impossible for anyone to be in such a secluded place on a night like this. The storm seemed to have driven out all living things except for this strange, faceless presence. Instinctively, I hid behind a tree, watching silently as the figure faded into the darkness, as if it had melted into the night itself. A shiver ran down my spine, but curiosity, that curse that has haunted me all my life, urged me on. I couldn't help it. The desire to understand, to discover what lurked in the darkness, was stronger than fear. I let the humid air soak my face and clothes as I advanced cautiously, not losing sight of the blurred footprints the figure had left in the mud. Each step I took brought me closer to the heart of the forest, to the source of the shadow that had crossed my path. The wind whispered louder now, as if trying to warn me, as if nature itself was trying to push me away. However, my steps were firmer, my determination growing stronger with every chink of uncertainty I crossed. I knew that the mystery of that place must be of great importance, something that could change the course of my writing, something that could provide the inspiration I so desperately sought. Finally, after a long stretch, I came to a clearing in the forest, where an ancient, moss-covered stone stood in the center. Its presence took my breath away, not only because of its age, but because of the feeling that something on its surface had been altered, as if its very existence had been marked by an invisible hand. I stared at the stone for a few seconds, searching for a rational explanation for the uneasiness that was beginning to sow itself in my mind. It was impossible not to notice the inscriptions on its surface, signs and symbols in a forgotten language that seemed to tell a story of betrayal and spilled blood, a tale of ancient sacrifices, of broken pacts and vengeful spirits. My pulse quickened as I read the markings with my eyes, though I could not fully comprehend them. Something inside me told me that this was the key to understanding what was happening. Evil, that ancient evil that had been sealed for generations, had been released, and I, in my obsession to discover the truth, had been the catalyst for its resurgence. The ground beneath my feet seemed to vibrate, as if the forest itself was breathing, aware of my presence, aware of my intrusion. The rain was falling harder now, as if the sky itself was trying to wash away the blood soaked into that cursed earth. The feeling of discomfort invaded me with force. The uncomfortable certainty that I should not go any further ran through me, and an inner voice was screaming at me that I should get away from there. The secret that lay buried in that place had to remain hidden, for it was clear that something was out to prevent me from discovering it. But there was no turning back. From the shadows, the hooded figure emerged again, this time more clearly. The light from the flashes of lightning fleetingly illuminated his face, and I could see the eyes glowing with a cold, malevolent light, as if darkness itself had taken over his being. His presence emanated an aura of danger and death, a palpable reminder that evil lurked in the darkest corners of humanity, patiently waiting to be awakened. In an instant, I understood the truth. What I had unleashed was no mere creature or specter. I had awakened an ancient force, a faceless, conscienceless entity that fed on despair, human suffering, and hopelessness. This force, as old as the forest itself, had been waiting for centuries, held back by a forgotten pact, a broken balance, and now that balance had vanished. I was trapped, doomed to witness the horrors that would be unleashed in that cursed place. The rain continued to fall mercilessly, but at that moment I realized that the storm was not just a natural phenomenon. The storm was part of something much bigger, something that had been unleashed by my own curiosity. My fate was already sealed. There was no escape from what had begun, and all that was left for me was to be a bystander in my own tragedy, a helpless observer of the horrors that would be unleashed. As the shadows loomed around me, I realized that the only way to fight this evil was to tell what was happening, to put it into words, to leave a testimony of my encounter with the unknown. Perhaps somehow, by doing so, I could prevent others from following my same path, from falling into the same trap I had stepped into. Perhaps my story would serve as a warning, as a reminder that evil lurks in the shadows, waiting for its moment to emerge and claim its prey. May this story serve as a testament to the darkness that dwells in each of us, patiently waiting to be released. May those who seek the truth in the darkest of places be prepared to face the consequences of their actions. And in the end, may they accept that there are secrets that must remain buried forever. The road seemed endless, and the constant sound of the rain hitting the windshield and the roar of the wind formed a symphony that, although disconcerting, was familiar to me. I was not worried, not even at first. I had embarked on this journey alone, seeking refuge from my own mind and from the world that kept generating noise around every corner. The solitary vacation was not a recent choice, nor a need for rest as most thought. It was an escape, a necessary disconnect from a life that had begun to suffocate me. There was something about the gray days and storms that offered me relief, a sense of distance from the chaos I had left behind. Even though the weather was not the most suitable for a long drive, nor the perfect conditions for hours of driving, something inside me urged me to keep going. The rain suddenly intensified, but the decision to continue was already made. I didn't think about what I was leaving behind or what awaited me. The car was my only companion, the only refuge that kept me from the turmoil of my mind. For miles, the landscape seemed to fade into a gray void. There were no signs of life, no people, no houses, no vehicles, just tall, thick trees, and the endless line of asphalt stretching before me. Then the GPS diverted me onto a secondary route, a dusty and lonely road I had never seen before. The road narrowed through the trees and visibility was almost nil, but something about the isolation was reassuring. The car was moving cautiously, but it seemed to be the only thing moving in that inhospitable landscape. In an unexpected turn, the headlights illuminated a sign that emerged from the fog. The sign, faded by the passage of time, read, Hotel El Cielo, in letters that were no longer entirely legible. It didn't look like a promising destination, but exhaustion overcame me, and I no longer had the strength to keep looking. I thought that any place could be better than the emptiness of the road. As I approached the entrance to the motel, a strange discomfort began to take its toll on my mind. The place seemed forgotten by time, as if it had been trapped in an era that no longer existed. The lights flickered outside, as if struggling to stay on, and the rain was still coming down hard on the roof and windows. What puzzled me most was the absence of any other presence. The parking lot was empty, without a single car, which, at that time of night, was not only strange, but disturbing. Despite the uneasy feeling that was beginning to invade my chest, I needed shelter, and there it was. The interior of the motel was even more unnerving. A heavy, stale air filled the space. The hallways were narrow, the carpet old and worn, and the fluorescent lights flickered as if they were about to go out at any moment. The silence was absolute, except for the echo of my footsteps echoing down the hallway. The reception desk was empty, but before I could think too much, a tired-looking man appeared, as if from nowhere. His long, pale face showed no sign of surprise at my arrival. Silently, he handed me the key and pointed to a room on the second floor. Without a word, he disappeared again behind the office door. Something about his attitude unsettled me, but I told myself there was no reason to hesitate. The room I was assigned to was as dilapidated as the rest of the motel. Although clean, the humidity was palpable, and the air was thick, as if it had never been ventilated. The constant rumbling of the storm outside added a layer of tension to the atmosphere, and although the bed was there waiting, I couldn't shake the uncomfortable feeling. I decided the best thing to do would be to relax, to take a shower to clear my mind of the road. of the fatigue, of everything I was bringing with me. However, as I stood under the hot water, something broke the stillness. A low, rhythmic sound like a dull tapping. At first I ignored it, thinking it was the rain hitting some part of the building, but the tapping repeated itself and something inside me told me it wasn't the wind. I hurried out of the shower, wrapping a towel around me, and headed toward the bedroom. The sound was coming from the wall I shared with the next room, a tapping at regular intervals, as if someone was counting, marking time. The feeling that something wasn't right came over me. My body was reacting before my mind, and although I had no reason to fear, I felt a growing anxiety. I decided to approach the door to the next room, even though my instinct was screaming at me not to. The knocking suddenly stopped as I put my hand on the door handle. A dead silence followed, one that felt too heavy. My breathing quickened as I thought about what was happening. Something was telling me I should turn back, but something else was pushing me forward. With a knot in my stomach, I went back to my room, but at the very moment I did, a barely audible whisper reached my ears, coming from the same room. Something was not right, and the pressure in my chest increased. Fear enveloped me, but the storm would not allow me to flee. Hours passed, or maybe it was just minutes, I didn't know. The pounding came again, louder, closer. I decided I couldn't stay any longer. No matter what was happening, something inside me told me I had to leave, but the hotel doors, the walls, everything seemed to trap me. Finally, my feet moved on their own. Again, I headed for the neighboring door, but this time, as I put my hand on the knob, I discovered that the door was open. I entered the room noiselessly, my heart in my throat. What I found inside was even more disturbing. The room, just as dilapidated as mine, was empty. But there was something there, something I couldn't identify. I didn't see it at first until something on the table caught my eye. An old notebook with yellowed and worn pages. Opening it, my hands trembled as I read the first words on the page. "They are watching." I sped up my reading, turning the pages, hoping to find something to explain the growing sense of dread. What I found were more disconnected words, more names, more dates. The same names appeared over and over again. And suddenly, I understood. The motel, the place, everything was connected to something much darker. Something that had repeated itself over time. It was an endless cycle, a place where victims, one after another, were trapped in a macabre routine with no escape. The notebook was not only a diary, it was a map of the victims, of the people who, like me, had come to that place and vanished. The connection was evident. The hotel, the rooms, the walls, everything was impregnated with an energy that I could not understand, but that I felt in the deepest part of my being. The knocking, the whispering, it all made sense now. I was in the middle of a pattern that had no end. At that moment, the silence was broken. Rapid, desperate knocking came from my room. Someone wanted in. My body froze, fear paralyzed me, and although the notebook was still in my hands, the answers were not coming. The door to the room opened slowly, but what happened next faded into a whirlwind of shadows and screams. When I awoke, it was already daylight, and the storm had ceased. I never saw the Hotel El Cielo again, nor the people who seemed to have been trapped there. But what terrifies me most is not what happened in that room, but the nagging feeling that something is following me, something that never let me go. Perhaps the real question is not whether I was a victim, but whether I still am, trapped in a cycle I can never break. There are places in this world we cannot comprehend, moments in time that mark our existence in ways we never imagined. And sometimes the answers we seek take us further than we think, to a point where we are no longer who we were, but part of something much bigger and much more terrifying. The rain lashed mercilessly against the roof of the old cabin. Each drop resounded like a sword clashing against a metal surface, and the sound was incessant, almost deafening. I was alone in the middle of nowhere, several hours' drive from the nearest town, in a thick fog that barely let me see the forest line beyond the window. I had no choice but to stay there. I couldn't risk going on, not on a night like that. The forecast had been clear, fierce thunderstorms throughout the early hours of the morning. My name is David, and I've been working as a forest reserve ranger for a couple of years now. I often spend weeks in this lonely area, with only the company of animals and nature to keep me busy. Life here is quiet, yet lonely. I have learned to appreciate the silence of the forest, the calm that isolation brings. It has allowed me to reflect, to concentrate on work, and above all, to disconnect from the hustle and bustle of the outside world. But that night, the solitude had transformed into something heavier, something more ominous, as if the silence that had always been my ally had turned against me. The storm was shaking the cabin with unexpected violence. The wind moaned through the cracks, and although the walls of the building were thick, the cold seeped through every nook and cranny. The fire in the fireplace burned brightly, but still something indescribable chilled my bones. It wasn't just the weather. There was something else in the air, something that stood between me and the usual calm I cherished, an uneasy feeling that had been with me all afternoon. I had arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon, after a long day of patrolling the woods. What seemed to be a quiet day turned into a nightmare with the arrival of the storm. As I settled inside, something caught my attention. A strange smell, like wet earth and metal, began to pervade the air. It wasn't something I could immediately identify, but it was familiar. Something in my subconscious recognized that smell, though I couldn't put a name to it. And then, when I looked out the window, the forest that normally appeared serene and majestic in its stillness seemed to hide something else inside. The mist not only covered the terrain, but seemed to engulf it, dissolving the boundaries between the visible and the invisible. The cold came not only from the cracks, but also from the sensation that something was watching me from outside. Irrationally, I was drawn to the idea that I was not alone. At first, I tried to ignore it, as one does with irrational fears. I had worked in secluded places before, and I had always known that the mind tends to play tricks in situations of extreme isolation. But that night, something told me it wasn't simply paranoia. Something was there, lurking in the dark beyond the fog. I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to go for a walk to clear my mind. I grabbed my coat, made sure the flashlight was charged, and opened the door. As soon as I did, the storm hit me full on. The wind knocked the breath out of me, and the rain, cold and biting, instantly drenched me. The world around me was plunged into pitch darkness, with the flashlight illuminating only a few meters around. I took a few steps onto the sodden path, hoping that the cool air would dispel the tightness I felt in my chest. However, the uncomfortable feeling only intensified. It was then that I heard the first rustling sound. It was not the sound of a branch snapping in the wind as I had first assumed. It was deeper, heavier, as if something large was moving through the forest. I stopped short and, heart racing, looked in the direction of the sound. But the darkness was total, and the flashlight barely illuminated a few yards. I could see nothing. But something deep inside me told me that I was not alone. I tried to rationalize it, to think it was the wind or an animal. But the feeling that something was stalking me, something I couldn't see, took my breath away. Another rustle, closer this time, made my pulse race even faster. And then, a dull sound, as if something heavy had hit the ground, made fear take over me completely. My mind began to cloud, and an idea insinuated itself into my thoughts. What if it wasn't the wind? What if it wasn't an animal? What if it wasn't anything natural? This last possibility chilled my blood. What could it be then? My logic told me I should return to the cabin, but my curiosity, or perhaps my fear, made me take a step closer to the edge of the forest. I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was very close. The pressure in the air was becoming more and more unbearable. Suddenly, a flicker of light. The flashlight I was carrying began to fail, and for a second it went out completely. The air stopped, as if time itself had decided to suspend. In that brief moment, I felt something invisible beside me, so close that I could sense the tension in the air. A shudder ran through my body, and the need to return to the cabin became almost urgent. I turned around, walking quickly, the sound of my own footsteps a distant echo in the din of the storm. Every rustle of the branches made me feel that something was following me. When I finally made it to the door and closed it tightly, I felt a brief relief, as if the wooden barrier offered me a protection that I knew deep down wasn't real. I made sure the door was securely closed, but even so, fear still rumbled in my chest. Something was not right. Something in the air was still unsettling me, even inside the cabin. The feeling of being watched did not go away. Minutes passed, maybe hours, but my anxiety did not diminish. The rain was still pounding the roof just as hard, but the sound no longer seemed to be just a reminder of the storm. It was as if each drop was a footprint, marking the passage of time as if I was trapped in a cycle from which I could not escape. It was then that I heard the sound that made me understand that I was not alone. A faint sound coming from the back of the cabin. Something was raking the ground looking for some way in. It wasn't an animal, it couldn't be. The back door was locked, I knew. Panic began to take hold of me. My breathing became ragged, and my hands were sweating despite the cold. The sense that someone was there out of my sight was so palpable that I felt completely helpless. The echo of the rain on the roof mingled with the sounds of that invisible presence, and fear turned to despair. What did that thing want? Why was it stalking me? What was it looking for in the darkness? I approached the table where the flashlight flickered again. When the light came on fully, it illuminated a corner of the cabin. In front of the window, there was something. A trail of mud, wet, as if someone had been there right in that spot, watching me through the window. But the window was closed, and the floor was covered by thick boards that didn't allow anything, much less anyone, to pass through. A shudder ran through my body. Now I understood. It wasn't just the wind or the storm. Someone had been there all along, and now it was playing with my mind. The cabin was not my shelter. It was a trap, and I had fallen into it without realizing it. Sometimes, the real terror is not in the monsters or the shadows, but in what we leave behind. In the traces we unwittingly leave behind as we walk through life. We think we are safe, secure in our shelter, but the truth is that there is always something lurking. Something we cannot see, but that is always there. The storm is not just a natural phenomenon. It is a reflection of the inner storm we all carry, that deep and inexplicable fear that hides inside us. We think we are safe, but the truth is that at any moment we can become the object of a hunt, and that's when the real terror begins. The storm continued to lash the mansion with the same fury with which it had begun. Although the night seemed endless, something inside me told me that the nightmare was just beginning. As the minutes passed, uncertainty gripped my mind. I had come there with the assurance of being an experienced surgeon, a man who had seen and dealt with the darkest shadows of being human. But that night, in front of that dilapidated Victorian mansion, I felt my ability to understand what was happening vanish like fog. I had done what had been asked of me, without questioning the motives. The operation had been long and complicated, but I had followed the steps perfectly, altering the appearance, the DNA, the fingerprint, even the timbre of the voice of the man lying on the operating table. However, something in his eyes disturbed me deeply. The eyes of that man, that brilliant engineer, were different, empty. As I manipulated his face, his skin, his identity, I felt not only his appearance change, but something deeper, something that went beyond the physical. The sound of the storm was becoming more deafening. The thunder rumbled as if the sky itself was trying to tear away the secrets that the mansion held. Each bolt of lightning briefly illuminated the room, casting distorted shadows on the walls. The dim light illuminating the operating table seemed to tremble, as if it feared what was happening in its vicinity. The pressure in my chest intensified as my mind continued to search for answers, though I knew I might never find them. The figure of the man on the table was still the same, but his body no longer responded in the same way. Something about his breathing was different, more shallow, as if he were caught in a state between life and death. Despite interventions, he did not seem to have fully returned to consciousness. Stranger still, there was something in the air, something almost palpable, that told me this man was not who he said he was. His mind, his essence, something had disintegrated during the operation. Somehow he had come to that place looking for protection, but he had been caught in a net that he could not escape. I turned away from the operating table, feeling the urgent need to get out of there. A deep feeling of discomfort ran through me, as if the mansion itself were alive, watching me. I looked around, searching for some way out, but the walls seemed to close in around me. My breathing quickened as a strange feeling of paranoia began to invade me. I knew there was something in that place I wasn't supposed to see, something I wasn't supposed to know. I approached the window, seeking respite, but the landscape stretched out in front of me was nothing but darkness and shadows. There was no sign of life around, but the figures I had seen moving through the garden remained in the gloom. Who were they? What did they want from me? There were no vehicles visible in the driveway, which only added to the bewilderment. I could not trust what my eyes were seeing. The storm not only covered the landscape, but also clouded my judgment. Suddenly, I heard something behind me. A soft sound, almost imperceptible, but enough to make my blood run cold. I turned quickly, but the room was empty. Fear began to take over my senses. Something was not right. That feeling was stronger than ever. The air in the room had become thick, almost impossible to breathe. What had I really done? I looked back at the man at the table. His eyes, though still open, no longer reflected anything. They seemed to absorb all the light falling on him, empty, as if he had lost all capacity for comprehension. The surgery he had just undergone had not only altered his physical appearance, but had dismembered his identity in an irreversible way. His mind, his soul were too altered to return to what they once were. He had changed more than his body could handle. And in that instant, his gaze, empty of life, accused me. Fear grew within me like an uncontrollable force. A whisper of discomfort crept into my mind. Perhaps I would never have been able to understand the true scope of the operation I had undertaken. The money, the promise of success, of power, had blinded me. But now all that was fading into the darkness. The storm was still raging outside, but in that instant, the silence that took over the mansion was far more terrifying. I felt the presence of something else in the room, something watching me, stalking me from the shadows. It was then that a figure appeared in the doorway. Tall, thin, with an invisible face under a dark mask. The figure made no sound. Its presence enveloped everything, as if somehow everything that had happened up to that moment was a macabre symphony in which I, the surgeon, was only a spectator. At that precise moment, I understood the magnitude of what I had done. I had not only altered a life, I had been part of something much bigger, much more dangerous, and now I was trapped in its nets. My fate was sealed. My mind began to cloud. I had done what had been asked of me without question, without stopping to think about the implications of my actions. The man on the table, the identity I had created for him, did not exist in the real world. I had operated on a body, but not on a person. Somewhere along the way, I had forgotten the meaning of my mission. It was no longer clear whether the man I had operated on really was who he claimed to be. Was he a victim or a pawn in a much darker and more complex story? Who were those who had hired me? Why had I accepted without question? The figure in the doorway did not say a word, but the presence emanating from it was enough for me to understand that my fate was no longer in my hands. Everything I had done had led me there, to that point of no return. The storm was still raging in the mansion, but now the storm was inside me. The fear was as real as the darkness around me. Finally, I understood that although I had been the surgeon who had altered the lives of others, the same had been altered irreparably. I could not get out of there. I could not escape the shadow that had enveloped me. My life had become intertwined with that man's, with the mansion, with the forces operating in the shadows. What seemed to be a simple surgical intervention had become something much deeper, darker, more irreversible. There was no turning back. Sometimes the line between good and evil blurs with frightening ease. We convince ourselves that our actions are justified by a greater purpose, by the need for money, power, or success. But when we plunge into the unknown, when we allow darkness to guide us, we risk losing something far more valuable, our own humanity. That man's story and mine is a reminder that every decision we make has consequences, some of them irreversible. The rain lashed against the roof of the cabin with relentless force, as if the sky itself was trying to unleash all its fury on the small building. The sound of the drops hitting the glass was deafening, a constant rumbling that left no room for tranquility. In the gloom of the room, the shadows danced to the rhythm of the wind that, howling like a hungry creature, filtered through every crevice. The storm outside the cabin was not only physical but seemed to envelop everything, straining the atmosphere to the limit. I, a lone fisherman, found myself there, in that secluded place, lost amidst the darkness, where only nature ruled and the legends of the lake became distant echoes of the mind. Every night after a day of fishing, I would retreat to my shelter, seeking solace in solitude, among the old wooden boards that made up the walls and the constant sound of the rain that accompanied me in my thoughts. That night, however, something felt different. Something in the air told me that I should not go out. The storm seemed fiercer than ever, and the wind not only howled, it seemed to warn, to scream that I should not defy nature that night. But my stubbornness, the same stubbornness that had led me to make fishing my life, urged me to ignore every omen. What could a man accustomed to the darkness of the waters and the crucible of the cold wind that had always been his faithful companion fear? The legend of the big fish was known to all, but it had never been caught. It was a mythical monster, a being of immeasurable proportions that inhabited the depths of that lake. No one knew for sure if it was real or just a tale used to scare novices, but I, like other fishermen, had heard the tales of those who swore they had seen it. It was the target of every man who went into those waters. I, however, was not only after him for the fame his capture would bring, but for something deeper, something that had been rooted in my soul since I was young, an almost obsessive need to find what others thought unattainable. Lightning intermittently illuminated the sky as I took my boat and paddled hard toward the center of the lake. The water churned violently, as if the very fury of the stormy sky was pouring into the waters, creating eddies that threatened to engulf me. The biting cold reached my bones, but my determination did not waver. The darkness was total, broken only by fleeting flashes of light that revealed a wild water surface, unrecognizable in its wrath. I paddled aimlessly, but knowing that the fate of that night, like all others, was written in the turbulent waters. And then, that's when I saw it. A huge shadow, gliding with terrifying elegance beneath the surface of the water. Its movement was slow but sure, as if it was watching my every move, assessing my presence. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead, but it wasn't fear I felt at that moment. It was something deeper, a visceral understanding that legends are never just that. What my eyes were seeing was not a figment of my imagination or the wind whispering to me through the branches. I was before the unthinkable, before what should never have been awakened. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The water, agitated and furious, surrounded me as that shadow slipped into the darkness, the gigantic form of what could have been a prehistoric creature or a being that did not belong to this world. Its eyes, two glowing dots in the blackness, stared at me, and somehow I understood that what was before me was not a fish, but something much older, much more sinister, something that did not belong to the realm of men. A shudder ran through my body as the boat rocked violently. The water around me began to move faster, as if all the energy of the lake was being concentrated into an oppressive force, a force that forced me to face what I had awakened in the darkness. The storm roared more furiously than ever, and I helplessly began to paddle it in a desperate attempt to escape that presence I could no longer ignore. Every paddle seemed futile, as if the current itself was coalescing against me, pushing my boat into the center of the unknown. Fear gripped me as never before. My mind, which had been trained to face the roughest waters and the strongest storms, could now only think of escape. I was no longer a defiant man of the sea, no longer a fisherman. I was an insignificant being in the face of something beyond human comprehension. Water surrounded me, shadows seemed to move around me, and a palpable presence of evil was felt upon me. I knew something was stalking me, but I couldn't fully see it. I didn't have time to think about it. I just paddled desperately, hoping to reach shore before it was too late. Hours seemed to pass in minutes, and finally, when the hut in the distance appeared as a distant shelter, terror began to take hold of my mind. I managed to crawl out of the water, falling onto the wet ground, soaked to the bone. I was trembling with exhaustion and fear, but my eyes kept staring at the water behind me. There, in the blackness, in the abyss of the turbulent waters, I felt the presence of those cold eyes watching me, waiting. The cabin, which had been my sanctuary for so many years, was no longer enough to alleviate the feeling that something had changed in me that night. Something had snapped deep within me, and the terror I had experienced was far greater than any monster. It was the fear of the unknown, the fear of what cannot be understood. No longer could I see the lake as before. No longer could I hear the storm without feeling a latent nightmare lurking in my mind. Now, in the silence that follows the storm, in the shelter of the cabin, I try to put into words what I experienced, though I know I will not be able to fully convey the magnitude of what happened that night. The terror resided not only in what I saw, or what I felt in the dark, but in what I discovered within myself. Because the real fear is not in the monsters that lurk in the dark corners of the world, but in those corners of ourselves that we do not know. Today, I no longer seek the legend. Solitary fishing no longer calls to me because I know that what we seek is not always what we want to find. Sometimes, what we seek is a reflection of our own obsessions and fears. And sometimes, in trying to confront them, we discover that it is we ourselves who awaken forces we are not prepared to understand. This story is a reminder that, in the deepest shadows, lurk not only mysteries of the outside world, but also the darkest corners of the human soul. The lesson is clear. There are things that should not be unearthed, and in the search for the extraordinary, sometimes it is best to leave the unknown alone, because we are not always looking for what we want, but for what haunts us in the deepest part of our being. I never imagined that an experiment of an ordinary night would become my worst nightmare. My name is Alonso Hernandez, and my life has been marked by an obsession, paranormal phenomena. As a scientist, I have always sought rational explanations, but deep inside me, there was always a spark of doubt that pushed me to look beyond the limits of logic. In 2022, during a thunderstorm of unusual proportions, something happened that changed my life forever. It was a dark night, so dark that the storm seemed to swallow everything, as if there was no sky or earth, just immense blackness. The wind roared outside the laboratory, and the rumbling of thunder vibrated the walls. But I was too absorbed in my research to notice what was happening in the outside world. My mind was focused on what I believed would be the greatest discovery of my career, the crossover between paranormal phenomena and alterations in human consciousness, something I had always considered marginal, but which now seemed closer to being real than ever. My lab was located in an old building, one of those that hardly anyone remembers anymore. The atmosphere was humid, the air dense, and the wires connecting the measuring devices buzzed with an almost palpable electricity. My experiments were based on inducing altered states of consciousness through electrical stimuli, in the hope of observing some inexplicable reaction, something that might prove the existence of a reality beyond the one we perceive. But that night, the storm played its own role, and what I thought would be one more step in science turned into something much more terrifying. I remember it was then that I decided to use a series of low-frequency waves, something I had been studying for months. I knew that storms could influence electromagnetic waves, and in my mind it was the perfect opportunity to do something big. I couldn't wait to see the results. So, with the storm roaring outside, I connected my device to the main generator and adjusted the frequencies. When I did, something strange happened. The light in the room flickered violently. The machine started making strange noises, and a deep hum filled the air. And that's when everything went out of control. I didn't know what exactly happened, but I felt as if everything around me vanished. The ground beneath my feet stopped being firm, and in the blink of an eye I found myself in a completely different place. A dark space, as if I had fallen into some kind of abyss. It was not a physical place, but the feeling of being trapped in it was as real as any other experience. I was surrounded by a thick, murky fog, with no visible path, no indication of direction. In my confusion, I tried to move, but something made me stop. Some kind of noise echoed in the distance, a dull, regular sound as if something or someone was at work. There were no voices or laughter, just the sound of metal clanging against concrete, the hum of machinery that seemed unstoppable. The tension in the air was so thick that I found it hard to breathe. I began to walk, driven by an inexplicable feeling of curiosity, or perhaps by the need to find a way out. The ground was dirty and rough under my feet, but my eyes could not focus on anything beyond the fog that hovered over everything. However, that feeling of being watched did not leave me. Something was following me, or at least, that was the feeling that came over me every time I made a decision. After what seemed like an eternity, I arrived at some sort of building. It was no ordinary building, but a structure that seemed to rise from the bowels of the earth itself, a collection of concrete and metal blocks that had no logical or coherent purpose. It was a construction that belonged to no known time or space. I could not see clearly what was inside, but a strange vibration in the air told me that something was happening inside. I approached, and that's when I saw it. There were men, not many, but enough to fill a small corner of this dark place. They were chained together, their bodies thin, emaciated, as if they were being subjected to an endless ordeal. They all seemed to be in some kind of trance. They didn't know I was watching them, but it was impossible for me to look away. They were part of something much bigger, something I should not have been involved in. They were being operated on, not with ordinary medical tools, but with strange machines that seemed to merge with their flesh. The sound of the machinery was deafening, but it wasn't this noise that chilled my blood. It was the thought of what they were doing to these men. Their appearance, their suffering, everything was designed to turn them into something else, something stronger, tougher. It was clear that this was all part of a construction, not just a building, but something much darker. I felt trapped in this place, as if the walls of the construction were living me, as if they were aware of my presence. My footsteps echoed on the concrete, and each time I moved forward, the murmur of the machine seemed to intensify. The tension mounted. The feeling of being trapped in something much bigger than myself weighed heavy in my chest. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew I couldn't go back. My mind began to whirl. Why were those men there? What were they building? And why had the storm dragged me to that place? It was all strange and distressing. I felt like an intruder in a parallel reality, where the rules I knew didn't apply. My scientific theories, my years of studying the paranormal, seemed insignificant in the face of this cruel truth. In that place, there were no answers, only suffering. Suddenly a scream broke the stillness. It was not a cry of pain, but of desperation, as if these men were struggling to retain some part of their humanity. It was a mute call, a plea to escape their fate. The sound pierced me like a knife, but something in me urged me on, to move closer to that center of operations. Perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of curiosity, I couldn't help myself. It was when I reached the center of the construction that I understood the absolute horror. It was not just a building under construction, it was a prison. A prison created to transform human beings into tools, into machines, into parts for a much larger construction, a construction that had no end. My brain began to overflow with information. I couldn't process everything I saw. What kind of monstrosity was taking place there? Who was responsible? And how had I gotten to this point? But there was no turning back now. I was trapped, caught in a web woven by human hands, by beings who thought they could dominate everything. In the end, I found no way out. I found no answers. I was just trapped in that place, unable to escape from the darkness that enveloped it. And the scariest thing of all is that I began to realize that I myself was already part of this game. There was no more science or explanation. There remained only the feeling that perhaps the storm had not dragged me to a strange place, but to an inevitable future that had already begun. A future in which humanity itself had become a construction, a machine that cannot be stopped. Then I realized that I no longer had the tools to get out. Perhaps I will never know. Looking back, the feeling of helplessness consumes me. I always believed that scientific advances could offer us definitive answers, that behind every mystery there was a logical explanation, that every paranormal phenomenon could be unraveled with the rigor of study. But what I experienced that night showed me that not everything can be understood with reason. There are aspects of existence that escape us, dimensions that we cannot touch, realities that we cannot conceive. My experiment not only led me to a physical place impossible to understand, but also introduced me to an existential labyrinth where logic and human suffering intertwine in an endless cycle. Perhaps in the end, paranormal phenomena are not just anomalies of reality, but the cracks through which we perceive what is hidden. Perhaps it is never about finding a concrete answer, but about learning to live with uncertainty. But what is certain is that if we ever get to know what is really behind all this, it will be too late to regret it. The future has already begun and there is no turning back. I am Juan Marcos, a helicopter pilot. Since I was able to fly, I experienced the feeling of absolute freedom. The sky, vast and infinite, offered me an indescribable peace. Flying was not only my profession, it was my life, my refuge. As I flew through the clouds, I felt that no trouble could reach me. I was so used to being at high altitudes where the world seemed so small that I never imagined that anything could go wrong. However, 5 years ago, everything changed. At that time, I was on a routine flight. It wasn't a particularly complicated assignment. I simply had to transport supplies to a remote area of a forest in the south. The weather wasn't the best, but nothing an experienced pilot like me couldn't handle. The sun was barely peeking out from behind the clouds, and the sky seemed to be predicting a light thunderstorm. I didn't think much of it. I knew I could weather any unforeseen event. Sometimes the weather turned fickle. but I had flown in much worse conditions. However, as soon as I climbed and left the coast behind, the clouds became thicker, darker, as if something was about to happen. I wasn't worried at the time. I thought it was all part of the weather game. It was then that the wind began to shake the helicopter hard as if it wanted to knock it down. The controls became imprecise. The gusts of wind were pushing me to one side, and the engine made a strange sound, as if it was struggling to stay on. As I tried to steady myself, the dashboard lights suddenly went out. A terrifying silence filled the cabin, interrupted only by the roar of the wind and the incessant pounding of the rain against the windows. My stomach cringed. The storm had gone from an inconvenience to a real enemy. The helicopter began to drop. Despite my best efforts to control the aircraft, I couldn't stop it from plummeting. The impact was brutal. I lost consciousness momentarily, and when I awoke, all around me was confusion. My leg was broken, my head was spinning, but worst of all was the feeling that I was trapped. I was inside the helicopter, which was wrecked, and the pain was unbearable. But I didn't have time to grieve. I unfastened my seatbelt and tried to crawl toward the exit. The sound of the wind and the storm outside reached me, and a sense of dread enveloped me. I knew I had to get out, but my body was not responding as I had hoped. I finally made it out, crawling on the mud and blood-covered ground. The forest surrounded me, but what disturbed me most was the thick fog that covered everything, as if the forest itself was absorbing the light. I could not orient myself. There was only darkness and shadows. The radio was not working, and my attempts to call for help were futile. I was completely alone. Desperate, I walked blindly through the trees, dragging my broken leg, looking for something, a sign, a clue that there was something beyond. The rain did not stop. Each step I took seemed heavier than the last. The feeling of being watched began to invade my mind. It wasn't just the sound of the storm or the rustling of trees moved by the wind. It was a presence, as if something in the forest was watching me. I tried to concentrate on my steps, but the restlessness grew in my chest. Then, through the fog, I saw what appeared to be a village. I could not believe my eyes. It was an isolated place, off the map, hidden among the trees. The houses were made of wood, aged by the passing of the years, and no light was visible in any of the windows. It was a lifeless town, in absolute silence, interrupted only by the roar of the storm. Something inside me told me that I should not approach, but my strength no longer responded. I crawled there, looking for shelter. At first, the village seemed deserted. The doors were closed, the windows dark, and everything was shrouded in an air of abandonment. There was no sign of activity, no sign of humanity. My instincts were screaming at me not to go in, but I had no choice. I felt on the verge of fainting. My leg ached and my head was spinning. I pushed open the door of the first house I found, and as I opened it, the creak of the threshold echoed in my ears. Inside, the atmosphere was cold, but there didn't seem to be anything abnormal. Or so I thought at first. The furnishings were rustic, antique. The tables, chairs, and bookshelves looked like something out of another era, but everything was arranged so precisely that I found it uncomfortable. It was as if every object in the house had a purpose, a function that I could not understand. On one of the tables, I found what appeared to be meat, although I couldn't identify it with certainty. Something inside me told me not to examine it too closely, but the temptation to understand what was happening was stronger than my fear. As I took a step forward, I felt a shiver run down my spine. It was as if the house itself was watching me. At that moment, I heard a sound that chilled my blood. A door opened slowly, noiselessly from the back of the house. Something inside me urged me to flee, but my strength failed me. I crawled into the darkness that was coming out of that new room. As I entered, the sight of the scene paralyzed me. In the center of the room, on a stone table, lay a body, or what was left of it. The man was almost decomposed, but his face still showed the terror of endless suffering. The most terrifying thing was not the body itself, but the atmosphere surrounding it. There was no pain in the air, only an eerie calm. It was as if death, in that place, was not something strange. It was part of life. Somehow, everything I had seen so far seemed to be shrouded in a shadow I didn't understand. I didn't have time to process what was happening. Heavy footsteps sounded behind me. At that moment, I knew I was no longer alone. They were men, in primitive clothing and with an empty, expressionless gaze. There was no hatred, no anger, just a disturbing calmness in their eyes. It seemed as if they knew that I was already trapped, that my fate was already sealed. Panic came over me. I tried to move, but my broken leg prevented me from fleeing. Before I could do anything, a firm hand grabbed me by the arm without violence, only with the certainty that I could not escape. I was dragged out into the storm, and the cold enveloped me completely. I didn't understand anything. I didn't know what was happening. I only knew that my life, as I knew it, had come to an end, and then everything faded into darkness. I woke up in a hut. I wasn't in the village, but I couldn't recognize the place either. The wind was still whipping hard, but the silence was absolute. My leg was immobilized, and the pain was unbearable. I couldn't move, I couldn't scream. The only thing I felt was the sensation of being watched, an invisible presence stalking me from the darkness. Days passed, maybe weeks. Time blurred in the gloom. The storm did not cease, and the wind continued to roar as if the forest itself was claiming me. The men who had imprisoned me were gone, but the feeling that something was stalking me, something faceless and nameless, never went away. I finally managed to escape, or at least I thought I did. I don't know if what I experienced was real or if it was all a hallucination provoked by pain. The only thing I know is that the forest never let me go. Fear has never left me. Sometimes when I look up at the cloudy sky, I feel that endless storm still echoing in my soul, like a distant echo that never stops rumbling. The real monster is not in the shadows of the forest, nor in the dark corners of the world. The monster is within us, in our minds and hearts, in the irrational desire to control everything, and sometimes that desire drags us into dark places where the storm never ceases. Today, after all I have lived through, I know that the worst thing is not the external storm. The worst is the internal storm, the one that rages inside us, that does not calm down with the passage of time, and that drags us to a place where we can never escape. The rain lashed the window of my car with unusual fury. The wind was sneaking through the trees, shaking their branches as if they were trying to escape the storm that never stopped lashing against the earth. At that moment, the sound of water and wind was all I could hear. Somehow it was a reflection of what I was feeling inside, a personal storm that didn't seem to want to stop. It had been a long road there, both literally and figuratively. The name Victor Otahola, once synonymous with success and culinary prowess, had slowly faded away. The fame he had achieved, built on years of effort, sacrifice, and passion, crumbled because of a failure as simple as it was tragic, a poorly presented dish. In the world in which I moved, that small mistake had been enough for the rest of the world to forget me. Chef Otahola had ceased to be a reference in the best restaurants, and with him, his dreams and his reputation. Now the doors of success no longer opened before me. Instead, everything seemed to close. A failure. One misstep, and my professional life was in ruins. That's when the invitation arrived. A letter, with no return address, that seemed almost out of place in my crushing defeat. At first, I thought it was a joke. A cruel joke, perhaps, orchestrated by those who had laughed at me in silence as I watched my career collapse. It said simply, "A once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for a chef like you to revive your career." The letter was full of vague promises and suggestions that became more and more tempting. Exclusive dining, select ingredients, luxurious surroundings. I couldn't resist. In my desperation, I saw in those words the only remaining door out of the darkness. I didn't hesitate for a second to accept. The mansion I drove to that night was secluded from civilization, surrounded by a thick forest of pine trees that in the darkness seemed to watch over me with invisible eyes. The car skidded over the mud, struggling to stay on the road, while water fell incessantly on the windshield. There were no lights, only the intermittent flashes of headlights that drew brief outlines of the landscape around me. The road seemed endless, and the sense of isolation became more and more palpable. Finally, the silhouette of the mansion appeared before me, imposing, crumbling with the passage of time. The stone structure, cold and somber, stood like a ghostly figure. The iron gate, rusted and tall, opened with a creak that echoed in the darkness. No one greeted me. There were no servants, no lights at the entrance, only a dim light from the windows above. A strange sensation ran through me, a kind of unspoken warning, but my mind was blinded by the promise of a new opportunity. So I moved forward. The door closed behind me with a dull sound, as if the mansion had engulfed me. The interior was even more unsettling. A long hallway with walls adorned by dim lights that flickered. The floor creaked under my feet, and the air was laden with a heavy, musty smell, as if the mansion hadn't been inhabited in years. But my mind was fixed on the target. I needed to move on. At the end of the hallway, a wooden door slowly opened, revealing the dining room. The table was set with almost surreal perfection. Elegant chairs, finely decorated dishes, and a crackling fireplace. It all looked like something out of a dream, a scene out of a fancy book. An opulent air hung over the place, but something inside me stirred. Despite the circumstances, the loneliness of the mansion, and the lack of explanation for what was happening, my desire for redemption pushed me to continue. And I did. I was led to the kitchen, a space that seemed tailor-made for a renowned chef, gleaming, shiny, perfect. In front of me, a table with meticulously arranged ingredients, each one more rare and exotic than the last. But something wasn't right. There was something about those ingredients that puzzled me. The meat, for example, was a color I had never seen before. It was dark with a texture I couldn't identify. The smell it gave off was also strange to me. However, I could not afford to hesitate. I was there for one reason: my chance, my redemption. I began to prepare the ingredients, to work with them as if I were a surgeon. Every cut, every move, required the same precision with which I had worked my entire life. However, as I progressed, something was taking hold of me. A feeling of discomfort, of repulsion that grew with each step I took. The blades, when cutting, did not respond as they should. The meat fell apart in a strange, stringy way, and the heat of the kitchen enveloped me like a suffocating blanket. Despite everything, I kept going. Dinner had to be perfect. I needed redemption. I couldn't afford to fail. The aroma that began to fill the kitchen was thick, and a hint of metal hung in the air. I was finding it harder and harder to breathe, but the storm outside wouldn't stop, and the work had to continue. I knew something wasn't right, but my ambition blinded me. The desire to get back on top, to regain what I had lost, was stronger than any warning signs in my mind. Finally, dinner was ready. The plate was impeccable. The meat, though strange, had taken a form that could be described as sublime in culinary terms. The presentation was perfect. The texture looked just right. Everything I needed to prove to the world that I could still be great. The dinner was everything I had dreamed of. All that remained was to serve it. As I entered the dining room, a strange gloom enveloped the scene. The diners were seated at the table, motionless, watching without speaking. But something in their eyes, something in their shadow-covered faces, made me feel a growing discomfort. It was at that moment, when I stopped at the table, that I understood. I looked at the plate once more. A knot formed in my stomach. I couldn't ignore it. It wasn't pork. It wasn't venison or any creature I'd ever known. It was human flesh. The shock of revelation shot through me like a bolt of lightning. The dish I had prepared was not a work of culinary art. It was a macabre feast. My mind could not process what I was seeing. How had I gotten to this point? How could I have been so blind? The question echoed unanswered in my mind. But it was too late. There was no turning back now. The kitchen door closed behind me, and I understood that I was trapped. The mansion was no longer a place of opportunity. It had become a prison, a place where the rules were different, where dark desires took shape, and where there was no way to escape. Today, 7 years after that night, I find myself behind bars. The mansion, the meat, the diners, all those memories haunt me like ghosts that keep whispering. The memory of what happened that night is still alive in my mind, a shadow that haunts me relentlessly. The walls of my cell reflect a distorted version of myself, an image I cannot escape. What led me there remains a mystery. Perhaps it was desperation. Perhaps it was the blindness of ambition. How much are we willing to sacrifice to regain what we have lost? How much are we blinded by the desire for redemption? The answer is uncertain, and the lesson, painful. Some opportunities are nothing more than traps, and some doors lead to dead ends. The worst dinner you can prepare is the one you serve yourself. Today, looking back, the storm I experienced that night seems like a distant whisper, but the weight of the truth of what I did is still with me. I cannot escape my own actions, nor the condemnation they brought. And in the end, I realized that some decisions, some choices, have consequences that last far beyond what we imagine. Sometimes in this life, the desire to regain what was lost can blind us so much that it leads us to do the unthinkable. And like me, some of us never manage to find the way out. There are times when the desire for redemption can cloud the clearest judgment. The quest for success, fame, or recognition can drag us to make decisions that not only change our destiny, but alter our humanity. Sometimes, what seems like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity is actually a trap that leads us down a path from which there is no return, and by the time we realize it, it is already too late. I am Eduardo Jose, a forensic psychologist. My work has brought me into confrontations with the darkest part of the human psyche. Those who cross the line between reason and madness. Those who, for various reasons, fall into the abyss of crime. My life has been forged in the study of human behavior, in the interpretation of the traces left by traumas, obsessions, and overflowing passions. I have always seen crime as a puzzle, an encrypted code that only waits to be deciphered by someone capable of reading in the shadows. Today, however, I am not a mere spectator of the troubled minds I deal with in my day-to-day life. Today, I am the protagonist of a story that is still incomprehensible to me, one that I may never fully understand. A story that unfolds before my eyes like a nightmare from which, even if I want to, I cannot wake up. It was a Monday, December 26th, when I received the call. The storm was lashing the city with unusual violence. The sky was covered by dark clouds and the rain was coming down in torrents, pounding the windows with fury as if the weather itself was overflowing, as if the world was about to collapse in on itself. My phone rang insistently, a call from the police asking for my intervention in a case they couldn't understand. Ritual murders in a small isolated town in the mountains. I don't know why they had chosen me. I didn't know what was in store for me, but the job appealed to me. The offer was unusual, but I accepted. I couldn't resist the temptation to take on a case that seemed to border on insanity. I took the train to that city I had never visited before, a place lost in the mountains, where the sun rarely managed to break through the dense clouds. As the train moved on, the storm worsened. The raindrops were crashing against the window glass with enormous force, as if they were trying to escape from somewhere even darker. The increasingly desolate landscape offered me no clue as to what I would find when I arrived. Despite the oppressive weather, something inside me told me that this case was not common. The atmosphere, dense and gloomy, foretold me that something much more terrifying than crime awaited me in that town lost in the mountains. When I finally arrived, the landscape seemed even more desolate than I had imagined. The town was trapped between mountains that seemed to press down on it, as if it could not escape. The streets, empty and deserted, held only echoes of a life that no longer existed. The air was heavy with humidity, the kind of bone-chilling dampness that makes even thoughts heavy. A strange feeling came over me. Something wasn't right. Something in the air told me that the city held secrets I didn't want to share. The feeling of unease was palpable. The case I was to investigate was no less disturbing. 3 women had been murdered in the last few days. The corpses were found in different places, but they all shared a macabre pattern. The bodies were arranged with ritualistic precision, as if someone was reenacting some kind of dark ceremony. The first victim was found in a field, surrounded by strange symbols, inscriptions that I could not identify at the time. The second, in an abandoned warehouse, with her eyes stitched shut and her mouth closed, an obvious sign that this was more than a simple murder. But the third victim was the one that left me paralyzed. The third woman was found in a place that made me shudder, in the house where I grew up. My mother had died years before and the house had been left empty. I never went back there. The pain of her loss had left me scarred, and leaving home was one of the decisions I made to flee the shadows that continued to haunt me. But there it was. The house I thought forgotten, now turned into a crime scene. The police had isolated the area, but I could not remain in doubt. I needed to see the scene with my own eyes. Something inside me urged me to do so, even though I knew that when I walked through that door I would not only face the remains of a dead woman, but also the echoes of my own past. The storm roared more intensely when I arrived. The house, as I remembered it, was dilapidated, crumbling from the passage of time, covered in mold and damp. Yet something inside was still intact, as if it had been suspended in time, awaiting my return. I entered cautiously, and an uncomfortable chill ran down my spine. The house seemed empty, but its presence was unmistakable, as if its walls held secrets that did not want to be heard. Every step I took made the floor creak beneath my feet, and the sound echoed in the darkness, as if the house was alive, waiting for something to happen. As I climbed the stairs, the air became even thicker. It was as if every corner was permeated with memories I no longer wished to face. And as I reached the room where the third victim was found, reality hit me like a bolt of lightning. The scene was macabre, but what really paralyzed me was not the woman lying on the floor, nor the way her body was laid out. What chilled my blood was the position in which she was found. She was lying down, arms outstretched at her sides, the way I used to lie as a child, staring at the ceiling, searching for an answer that never came. The similarity was too unsettling. Something inside me told me that this woman was not just another victim. She was a message for me. At that moment, I understood that the case was not just about isolated crimes, but about something much more personal. I returned to the police station with a growing sense of unease. I needed answers. I demanded the full reports of the two previous victims. It was then that I realized something truly terrifying. All three women had something in common. At some point in my career, they had been involved in cases I had worked on. Women trapped in lives racked by psychological suffering, victims of profound disorders that I had tried to understand but perhaps failed to save. In each case, I had intervened in some way. But most frightening of all was the realization that this was not just a random killer. These women, the victims, were not mere nameless bodies. They were symbols of my own guilt. As I delved deeper into my career files, I found the answer I feared. A case that had marked the beginning of my career. A serial killer who had escaped justice. For years, I had believed that his capture had closed the case, that it was all over. But it wasn't. The man was never gone. He had left clues in every crime, but I hadn't known how to read them. I hadn't wanted to see what he was showing me. And now, someone was making me pay for my blindness. The storm outside the police station seemed to be reaching its climax. The rain pounded on the windows with increasing fury, as if nature itself was reflecting the internal chaos that was beginning to consume my mind. I could not escape the feeling that all this was the price I had to pay for not having stopped the real culprit years before. I made the decision to return to the house. Something told me that the final answer lay there, in those empty corridors that held secrets I had never wanted to face. The house was more sinister than before. The rain did not stop. The air inside was even thicker, as if it was enveloping me in a deadly embrace. I walked slowly through the halls, each step echoing in the darkness. And then I saw it. A figure in the corner of a room, motionless. The face, vaguely familiar, chilled my blood. A man who was no longer alive. A man who at some point I had given up for dead, not knowing that his shadows were still alive. It was him, the real killer, the man I had thought I had stopped but whose influence had never disappeared. In that instant, I understood the truth. The killer had never left. He had only been waiting for the right moment, hoping that I, blind in my arrogance, would not see him. All this was a punishment for my lack of vision, for not having understood the connection earlier. The storm outside was no longer just water. It was a rain of memories, of regrets, of unresolved guilt. The darkness of the house was not only that of its walls, but mine. In the end, this case, this death spiral, was nothing more than a manifestation of something much deeper. The truth we always avoid facing, that we cannot always run away from our own demons, no matter how far we go. The past never forgets. And the ghosts we think we have left behind are always lurking, waiting for the moment to reclaim what belongs to them. Sometimes the storm is not just a natural phenomenon. It is the echo of our own inner storms, the ones we have left behind unresolved. And those storms, sooner or later, always find their way again. The rain beats furiously against the window, as if the sky itself had decided to release all its rage at that moment. The drops resound with unusual force, and the wind shakes the nearby trees, causing an endless number of rustling sounds that run through the structures of the old church. It is a fierce, uncontrollable storm, as if the world as a whole has decided to crumble, taking with it the peace that this place might once have had. I am a bricklayer, no more than a common man seeking to make his life among the shadows of a city that never rests, among the ruins of a system that drowns in indifference. Ever since I started working here in this church, something has been weighing on me. Restoration, I was told. But what I have been asked to do here is nothing like the restoration of an ancient structure. It's not just about repairing sagging walls and ceilings, recovering details lost to the passage of time. No. This place has something else. Something I can't explain in words. Something that claws at my insides. It is oppressive. As if the stone walls that compose it contain secrets that were not meant to come out. Secrets that only a few, very few, were meant to know. Every time I entered, I felt a pressure in my chest, a thick air enveloping me as if the church itself was watching me, waiting for something from me. That night, the storm was relentless. The rain pounded with such intensity that the roof of the church creaked, and the wind came through the cracks, forming a strange echo that seemed to mock my thoughts. My day was done, or so I thought. Fatigue had taken hold of me, but I decided to stay a while longer, cleaning one of the oldest walls. That's when I saw it. A loose stone, something I hadn't noticed before. At first I thought it was just another crack, a fissure in the wall that in time could be repaired. But something told me that I shouldn't ignore it, that I couldn't let it go. With a mixture of curiosity and caution, I pushed the stone with the palm of my hand. At first it didn't budge, but with a little more pressure the stone shifted, and with it, a small fragment of wall crumbled. At that moment, something awoke inside me. An unsettling feeling came over me, but I couldn't help myself. Why not investigate? What could be behind that crack? What I found was not what I expected. As I opened the passage, a dark tunnel revealed itself before my eyes. The air inside it was dense, impregnated with humidity, as if time had decided to stop in that place, covering it with centuries of oblivion. I descended a flight of stairs embedded in the stone, each step echoing in the gloom with a strange echo, as if something or someone was watching me from the shadows. I could not turn back, though fear was beginning to take hold of me. Something deep inside me urged me to keep going, as if something was calling me. The tunnel was longer than I had imagined, and at the end it led into a small room. The darkness was total, the air stale, dense. The light from my flashlight barely made it through the heavy air. In the center of the room there was a table, and on it a large book, closed with a rusty chain that kept it sealed, as if the very essence of the book was too dangerous to let it free. Without much thought, I reached over and took it. Instantly I felt a pressure on my chest, as if in lifting that book I had unleashed an ancient force I could not comprehend. But it was too late. The decision had been made. Instantly a creaking sound echoed in the distance, like wood giving way under the weight of something. I turned quickly and saw a door I hadn't noticed before. It didn't fit in with the surroundings, with the old church. It was a small door, thick wood, worn, as if it had never been opened in centuries. Something inside me urged me to open it. I didn't know what I expected to find, but the weight of curiosity pushed me to act. As I turned the handle and opened the door, the air inside the room immediately hit me. Cold and darkness enveloped me, and I felt as if an invisible hand was pulling me inside. What I saw on the other side of the door left me paralyzed. It was a small room, muddy and damp, filled with darkness. Inside, several women lay in chains, some sleeping, others awake, their eyes empty, lost in a despair that seemed to have no end. Their faces were marked by suffering, the scars of years of abuse. My heart was pounding. My mind could not comprehend what I was seeing. How could this be possible? Why had no one told me? How had I come to this place without knowing? It was in that instant that I knew. The passageway was not just a forgotten tunnel. It was a prison, a place of suffering and pain hidden in the very heart of the church, under the facade of faith and devotion. And more than that, I understood that I, in my ignorance, had been part of it. For weeks I had worked alongside the man who called himself a priest. I had let myself be guided by his facade of goodness, by his sermons and his apparent devotion. But it had all been a lie. The priest was not a man of faith. He was a predator, a monster camouflaged in the garb of a saint. And I, blind in my confidence, had seen nothing. My mind was spinning, looking for a way out, an explanation. How could this be? I had spent so much time there, trusting in him, in what he said, in what he represented. But now, looking at that scene, the truth was undeniable. This church was not a place of faith. It was a trap. A center of operations for a dark network, where the suffering of these women was used as merchandise, where their lives were worth nothing more than pieces of an endless gear. How many more? I could not know. But I knew that what I saw was only a small part of something much bigger and much more horrible. I felt trapped, unable to move, not knowing what to do. Would running away be enough? Could I escape the guilt, the shame of having been an unwitting accomplice? I couldn't just sit idly by. I knew I had to do something. I could not let these women remain trapped. Let the priest remain at large. Let this web of darkness continue to operate without anyone doing anything. But what could one man do against such a perverse system? What could he do when the church, the place where he thought he was building something good, was in reality a mask behind which evil was hiding? The storm was still raging outside, but inside that church, the wind only whispered warnings. My soul felt broken, my mind fragmented by the truth. But something told me I had to do the right thing, even if the price was high. I made a decision. I didn't know if it would be enough. I didn't know if I would succeed in saving those women or stopping the priest, but I had to try. I knew that the lives of those people no longer depended on me, but at least I would not be an accomplice to their suffering. I left the room with my heart in pieces, and although my footsteps echoed in the cold walls of the church, I felt that something inside me was already gone. That night, my soul was no longer the same. Darkness doesn't always show itself with terrifying screams or grotesque monsters. Sometimes it hides under the mask of what we think is good, what we think is holy. The real darkness, the most dangerous darkness, is not in the shadows, but in the people with whom we share the world. In those we trust without question. In those who, like me, fall into the trap of comfort and ignorance. And even if the storm continues to rage outside, even if the church remains a place of suffering and manipulation, I can no longer be the same. Human darkness has no boundaries, and the consequences of our actions or our passivity never go away. Sometimes evil disguises itself as the most harmless thing, and we are accomplices without realizing it. Shadows are not always alien to us. Sometimes we find them where we least expect them. I am Carlos, a park ranger in a national park, one of those places forgotten by most people. Every day, my routine is one of silence and isolation. The trees, imposing and eternal, are the ones that accompany me as I walk the trails, check the fences, and make sure everything is in order. I have no visitors, no tourists, no guides in need of guidance or care. There are no celebrations or events. It is a place that has been abandoned by the world, as if it only exists for me and the nature that inhabits it. Loneliness has become part of me. I have learned to live with it, to listen to the rustle of dry leaves under my boots, the distant song of a night bird, and the constant whisper of the wind through the pines. Yet sometimes I wonder if all this makes any sense at all. Why am I still here? Why keep watching these trails that no one else walks? Who would care if someone gets lost, or if small slips are committed in the safety of this vast and lonely landscape? The authorities hardly ever visit the place, and the times they do are so few that I can barely remember their faces. Despite the solitude, the park remains a place of wild beauty. A complex ecosystem with its flora and fauna, so dense and mysterious that it seems to be waiting for something. Something that, in my years as a park ranger, I never fully understood. However, I never thought about it until that night. A night that changed my life and made me understand that sometimes nature hides much more than it seems at first glance. The storm started at dusk. First, just a few flashes of lightning on the horizon, as if the sky wanted to warn us. Then, the rain began to fall intermittently, as if nature was vacillating between giving in and overflowing. It wasn't just any storm, although I had experienced many in my job. There was something in the air that time, a strange sensation, a pressure I couldn't describe. The wind roared loudly through the trees, and the sound of the storm enveloped me in a kind of blanket of total isolation. I was walking through the most secluded part of the park, a place she rarely visited because of its inaccessibility, when I saw her. In the middle of the storm, in the thick fog, a solitary figure was silhouetted. At first I thought it was an illusion, something caused by the combination of water and wind. But as the figure approached, I felt a shiver run down my spine. It was a woman. She was soaked, as if the storm had not stopped battering her, but her gait showed no signs of struggle. Her face was pale, her eyes empty, and she walked slowly, as if the storm had no impact on her. She was not a normal presence, not human in the most common sense of the word. Her gait, though erratic, seemed to have a purpose. She did not seem lost, nor frightened. In fact, the woman seemed completely indifferent to everything going on around her, as if the storm, the trees, the wind, and the rain were just an extension of herself, unimportant. Before I could approach, I heard something behind her. They were not natural sounds. It wasn't the thunder or the rustling of the storm. It was footsteps. But not just any footsteps. They were heavy, shuffling, echoing over the sodden ground with a cadence that didn't belong to nature. At first I thought it was some hiker who was also caught in the storm, but I soon realized it was not. I saw the silhouettes. They were men, tall, thin, and their form moved with a strange precision, as if they were shadows rather than human beings. They did not make noise, they did not breathe heavily, but they glided through the trees with the calm of one who knows he is in control of the situation. Their movements were cold and calculated, as if perfectly timed, as if they were waiting for something or someone. Something in their presence made me stop in my tracks, as if my body was recognizing a danger that my mind could not yet grasp. I looked at the woman. Despite being surrounded by the men, she did not seem frightened. Her face was still empty, but her eyes now had something different. An eerie calm, as if she was no longer running away from anything, as if she had stopped fighting, as if she had accepted her fate. Instinctively, something inside me urged me to move. Maybe it was the urge to help someone in distress, or maybe it was the need to understand what was happening. I couldn't just stand by and watch from a distance. I couldn't let something happen without doing anything. I slipped through the trees, trying to move as fast as possible, but the slippery ground and the storm made every step difficult. I had barely advanced a few meters when one of the men raised his head. He had sensed something. A shiver ran down my spine. Before I could react, I rushed toward him, knife in hand, trying to surprise him. But the rain and the mud made my movement clumsy, slow, and he managed to dodge me easily. However, I managed to reach him, and in a flicker of confusion, I plunged the knife into his arm. The man let out a scream, a muffled one, which was quickly drowned out under the roar of the storm. At that moment, everything became confusing. The other men spun toward me, their movements cold and calculated, and in the blink of an eye, they surrounded me. Each seemed trained with the patience of those who have dealt with situations like that 1,000 times. There was no shouting, no noise, just a deadly silence, thicker than the storm itself. I felt small, insignificant, as if my efforts were useless. No matter how hard I tried to fight, no matter what I did. They just waited. No one seemed to be really concerned about the fight. It was as if they already knew how this would end. The fight went on for what seemed like hours. I was exhausted, my movements slow, my body covered in blood. But not just my own. At some point, I managed to knock one of them down, but what surprised me was that when he fell, his face showed no pain, no effort, just an eerie calm. It was no longer a fight. It was a waiting. I wasn't fighting for my life, but for something bigger, something I couldn't even comprehend. Finally, one of the men caught me. His hands, huge and strong, held me with inhuman strength. I tried to break free, but his grip was unstoppable. I couldn't move. I couldn't do anything. My body was trapped in a web of power and control that I could not understand. And at that moment, everything stopped. I looked up at the woman, and that's when I understood. Her face had changed. She was no longer the same as before. She was no longer the victim. Now her eyes reflected something completely different. No fear, no pain, no despair, just a kind of acceptance. His presence was no longer that of someone trapped in a nightmare, but of someone who had somehow accepted his fate. And in that instant, I understood that she did not need to be saved. She was part of something much bigger, something that I, as a simple ranger, could never understand. The last of the men let go of me, and in that instant, I felt as if something inside me broke. It was not a physical pain, but something deeper, something I could no longer undo. The storm was still raging and the forest was still the same, but I was no longer the same. I was no longer the lone ranger who knew this place. Now somehow I was part of it, part of its mysteries, trapped in a cycle I couldn't understand. The park is still the same. The trees sway in the wind, the rain falls as hard as ever, and the storm still visits whenever it chooses. But I am no longer the same. I am not the man who once walked these trails searching for his purpose. Now I am just another one of the secrets this place holds. Sometimes nature confronts us with something we cannot understand. Sometimes the terror comes not from the unknown, but from what is already there, waiting hidden behind the shadows. Maybe there never was an escape. Maybe there never was. The storm unleashed its fury on the city with unusual violence, as if the sky itself was trying to drag everything into the abyss. The rain pounded furiously on the windows of the car, and the sound was so deafening that it seemed as if the road itself was going to disintegrate under the pressure of the downpour. But despite the chaos outside, Orlando Bermudez kept moving. He was too close to the destination that had been set for him, and he was not going to stop. Not yet. The message had been clear, too clear. That invitation, with its cryptic words, had caught his attention from the moment he read it. For the chosen only, it said, inviting him to a private event, an art auction rarely accessible to the eyes of an ordinary collector. And though something inside him whispered that he should ignore it, that it could be a trap or worse, a call into the unknown, Orlando couldn't resist. He knew he had to go, that this opportunity could not slip through his fingers. After all, it wasn't just about adding a new piece to his collection. It was about something deeper, something he didn't understand but which drew him irremediably. Orlando was, as his business card said, an art collector. But his relationship with the works he acquired went beyond simple aesthetic admiration. For him, each painting, each sculpture contained something hidden, something that was not visible to the naked eye. What others saw as simple traces of paint or marble, he interpreted as stories of past lives, of shadows hidden among the colors, of secrets kept by those who had owned those pieces before him. The story behind each object fascinated him as much as the work itself, and that obsession had turned him into a connoisseur of the darkest passages of art. But of course none of this prepared him for what he would find that night. The gallery was in a corner of the city, on a street that seemed to vanish in the fog. The entrance was inconspicuous, almost imperceptible, with a dark wooden door and a nameless metal plaque. Not even the sound of the storm seemed to reach there, as if the building was secluded from everything that was happening in the outside world. Orlando stepped out of the car and, heart racing, crossed the threshold. The cold air, mixed with moisture from the rain, instantly seeped through his pores. Inside, the place was plunged into almost total gloom. Dim lights illuminated the walls, where large paintings hung, arranged with eerie precision. Each of them seemed to be watching him, awaiting his reaction, his judgment. The air had a strange density, as if time inside that gallery had stopped or perhaps accelerated. It was a space where the shadows lengthened and the colors became more intense, as if the atmosphere itself was impregnated with the stories that the works told. At first, Orlando thought it was simply a private art auction, an occasion to acquire valuable pieces. But as he approached the auction table, the feeling that something was not right came over him quickly. There were no other people there, at least not at first glance. The auctioneer was not present, and the room seemed empty of human life, although something or someone seemed to be waiting in the shadows. The rain was pounding the windows hard, as if she too was aware of the strangeness of the place. All was silent, broken only by the rumbling of the storm outside. The first works were presented. At first glance, they seemed to be pieces of great quality, the kind you would expect to find in a high-level exhibition. But as Orlando looked at them, something inside him told him there was something more. They were not only paintings, they were not only artistic representations. Something in the shapes, in the lines, in the way the figures were arranged, made him feel that there was a hidden message, something dark. One of the first pieces that caught his attention was a portrait of a woman. At first glance, it looked like a conventional work of art, the figure of a lady with a serene, almost sad expression. But as Orlando got closer, as his eyes took in the details, something made him shudder. The woman's eyes reflected no life. They seemed empty, uninhabited. as if her soul had been absorbed by the painting itself. And in the corner of the painting, barely visible, there was a shadowy figure, a silhouette hidden in the shadows, almost imperceptible. It was as if someone was lurking, watching from a place outside the painting, but not as a mere presence. It was as if that figure, or the absence of it, had been part of something much larger and much darker. As the pieces passed, Orlando felt the horror begin to take over his mind. Each painting he saw seemed to be more disturbing than the last. In one painting, a man stood in the middle of a pool of blood, his eyes empty, staring at the viewer. It was not a simple portrait of a murderer, nor a scene of gratuitous violence. There was something more in that gaze, something that seemed to warn the viewer that this image was not just a representation, it was real. In another painting, a woman embraced a knife in despair, but behind her, almost in shadows, a figure could be seen, a presence that dominated her. It was not a simple illustration of a macabre scene. There was something else, something she couldn't quite understand. The works were not only disturbing because of their technique or the subjects they dealt with, but because somehow Orlando began to notice that they all seemed connected, not just because of the artists, but because of the subjects depicted. Each one showed the same thing: murders, persecutions, disappearances. But not only that. Each victim, each figure seemed to be linked in some way to the previous ones. A dark pattern emerged, one I could not ignore. At that moment, one of the larger paintings caught him. The canvas showed a disfigured figure standing in front of a broken mirror. The reflection was not the face of the figure, but that of another being, one with empty eyes, filled with despair. As Orlando got closer, he saw something else. Between the cracks in the mirror, barely visible, was a sequence of numbers. Panic overcame him. Those numbers didn't seem to be just random details. They looked like dates of murders, perhaps of missing persons. They were the key, the connection between all the paintings. But what did they mean? Terrified, Orlando tried to understand. The rain was still falling furiously and the lights flickered, as if the place itself was reacting to his growing discomfort. At that instant, the door to the gallery slammed shut. The sound was thunderous, like the closing of a sarcophagus. The feeling of claustrophobia took hold of him, and terror, that irrational terror that only shadows can provoke, began to take hold of his mind. Reality blurred around him. He no longer knew whether he was inside an art gallery or trapped in the same labyrinth of despair that the paintings depicted. The paintings, which had seemed static before, were beginning to come alive. The shadows in them were moving, as if the figures trapped in those canvases wanted to leap out at him, to claim him, to drag him to their destination. The dates, the numbers, the connections between the paintings were no longer mere details. They were warnings, and he had been the one chosen to understand them. Orlando Bermudez could no longer leave the gallery. The storm was still raging outside, but none of that mattered anymore. Inside, the paintings continued to whisper dark secrets to him, and he became part of them. In the end, he realized that art had not only been a window into suffering, it was a trap that had caught him in its net. And now, you, the one reading these words, could be next. The gallery continues to wait, the shadows continue to move, and art continues to tell stories that are not always meant to be understood. He had been working for years as a conflict peacemaker, as they used to call him. It was not an official position, nor a position with a title or recognition, but it was the job I had come to know, and somehow, I had become something close to an expert. My task was to intervene in situations where human tensions reached their peak, before violence broke out. I always tried to handle situations discreetly, without leaving a trace. I was not a man of words or unnecessary confrontation. My job was based on getting everything back to normal without anyone really noticing that anything had happened. Most of the time, the job was simple. A problem between two parties that could be resolved with a couple of meetings, a moderated talk, and a promise that everyone would calm down. But there was something I had learned over the years. Conflicts are not always so simple. Often, the roots of unrest sink into people's darkest corners, into what they keep quiet about, into what is unseen. And that, more than words, is what makes a situation spiral out of control. On October 13th, 2004, however, something in the air was different. A call I was not expecting, an assignment I could not refuse, took me to a remote village, lost in some forgotten corner of the national geography. The rain was already beginning to hit the windshield when I arrived, an incessant and rhythmic beat that seemed to mark the compass of what was about to happen. From the first moment, the atmosphere was dense, charged with foreboding and darkness. The trees swayed as if they shared the tension in the air, and the houses along the main street seemed to almost crumble under the pressure of the storm. There was something about the place that I could not identify, something in the elusive looks of the few who still ventured through the streets. It wasn't fear, at least not visible fear. It was more like a dull whisper that ran along the walls of each building, a murmur that intensified each time the storm lashed harder. In the background, you could hear the sound of thunder, but also the sound of uncertainty, like a distant echo that no one dared to name. The man who controlled the town, and who called himself the Regent, was not known by his face but by his power. No one knew his real name, nor did they want to know it. They only knew that if you didn't give him what he wanted, your days would become ephemeral, fleeting as the blink of an eye. Ownership in this city was their main objective, and whoever they didn't hand over what belonged to them simply disappeared. But this was no ordinary disappearance. These were not people who simply vanished without a trace. It was much worse. The disappearances were public, observed by all, with a touch of terror that lingered in the air, imprinted on the minds of those who remained. The town had become a playground for the Regent, a man who sought not only power, but a supremacy so profound that he wished to erase all hope, all resistance. My task was simple on the surface: to negotiate, to try to diffuse tensions, to get both sides to the table and come to an agreement. The problem was that one side was not interested in negotiating. The Regent did not want concessions. He wanted everything to be under his rule, and apparently he had already begun to implement his method. I entered the church looking for the priest, the only man in town who dared to speak out in public against El Regente's control. The church, however, was empty. Only a row of broken pews, some of them burned, and cracked walls accompanied me as I walked inside. The atmosphere was oppressive, as if time had stopped here long ago. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps on the floor above echoed through the compound. I stopped. I was not alone. However, I saw no one. Only a door slowly closed in the background. That made me alert, but I still decided to move forward. The priest had left a note, and with it the same cryptic message that all the previous informants had given me. Don't try to stop him, it's too late. The rain was still falling with the same insistence. The city seemed to be in a kind of slumber. No one wanted to act, but everyone knew what was happening. I headed towards the square again, trying to understand what was really going on. It was then that I saw the first signs of what had been happening. Off to the side, near one of the largest properties in town, I saw two bodies lying on the ground, almost hidden by the rain. It wasn't clear if they were dead, but the way they lay there without any movement, without any sign of life, made me assume the worst. There was no trace of struggle, only the mark of dull terror on their faces. Unable to help myself, I looked toward the nearby building. A small sign with the name of the property still hung crookedly on the facade. The Regent had left his mark. The rain was still falling, but something had changed inside me. I had come looking for a solution, looking for a peaceful way out, as I always did. But it was not so simple. The signs were clear. It was no longer about resolving a conflict. This place was no longer capable of being pacified. The evil that had been brewing there was much deeper. It was a disease that had corroded the very foundations of the people, of their values, of their humanity. The Regent was not just a man who lusted for power. He was no ordinary tyrant. What he wanted, what he really wanted, was to destroy everything that had been built on the foundations of that city. He wanted to eliminate hope, the belief in goodness. He wanted to wipe out one by one the people who still held some humanity. The people in the town were unable to see this, not because they were fools, but because they were trapped, suffocated by fear, by the despair of having lost everything. The night closed quickly. The town, plunged in darkness, had nothing but shadows and ruins. The empty houses, the dilapidated buildings, everything seemed to be part of a macabre scenery where life was no longer more than a trace erased by the rain. The violence that had begun as a simple conflict of power had now become a psychological game, a war of attrition where the victors were not those who possessed the most weapons, but those who had managed to break the souls of others. In my search for answers, I entered one of the most intact houses which seemed to have been forgotten by the destructive hand of the regent. At the back, on a worn wooden table, something gleamed. An antique gold watch of a brand I recognized as that of the priest. The object was in perfect condition, almost as if it had been deliberately placed there. It was then that I understood. The priest had not been killed for his beliefs, nor for resisting the regent. He had fallen because he had wanted to fight against something much greater. Against the emptiness that the regent had sown in every corner of that town. I left the house with a sense of defeat, as if the air itself was crushing me. Everything I had tried to do had been useless. The people had not only been stripped of their identity, of their resources, but also of their humanity. And while my task had been to prevent violence from erupting, what I had found there was not something that could be diffused with a simple talk. The storm continued its unstoppable course. The town, like a dying being, seemed to exhale its last breath. And as I walked away, leaving it behind, I knew there was something bigger at stake, something I could not fully comprehend. I had learned something that night, though it may not have been the lesson I had hoped for. The greatest threat to our survival is not the monsters we fear, but the voids we allow to grow within ourselves. In the darkness of that storm, I realized that not all conflicts can be appeased, nor can all wars be won. Some battles simply destroy ourselves, and when I looked back, there was nothing but silence. The storm that night was like a constant roar, a roar that seemed to want to swallow everything. The sound of the rain hitting the windows of the museum was deafening, and the drops slid down the glass as if they wanted to escape from something darker. My name is Fermin Gonzalez, and I am the curator of a small museum, almost forgotten by the city. This place has existed for more than a century, but few people know of its existence, or if they do not dare to enter. For me, however, it was a refuge, the only refuge left. That night, like so many others, I stayed after closing time. It was a habit of mine to check out the old pieces, the lesser-known collections, especially on nights like that, when the storm made the city seem like a distant, isolated place. I felt safe in that building, among its cold walls and dark corridors, surrounded by objects of historical and cultural value. But that storm changed everything. It all started when I decided to go down to the basement. The museum's basements had always attracted me, not only because of the stale air and the dust that seemed to have adhered to every corner, but also because they housed the rarest objects, those that were not exposed to the public, perhaps because of their fragility or their peculiarity. Some of these artifacts came from private collectors who preferred to remain anonymous. Others had been acquired at discreet auctions. My job was to catalog them, to study them, to give them meaning in the museum's history. That night, as I descended the creaking stairs leading to the basement, I felt a strange uneasiness. Something in the atmosphere had changed. I didn't know if it was the sound of the storm or the weight of the silence that gripped every corner of the museum, but there was a sense of danger in the air, as if the darkness of the basement had taken on a life of its own. I decided to ignore it. It often happened to me that my mind, especially when I was alone, played these little tricks on me. So with flashlight in hand, I made my way down the last few stairs and found myself in the storage room. The basement wasn't very big, and most of the rooms were covered with white sheets that gave the place a ghostly feel. Although, as always, I knew that was all just a trick of the mind. My flashlight rested on a table in the center of the room, and there, among other objects, I saw something I had never seen before. An artifact, covered by a black cloth, that did not belong to any of the museum's known collections. It was not very large, perhaps the size of a thick book. But what surprised me was not its size, but the way it was decorated. The metal, or at least what appeared to be metal, had an unusually smooth texture, almost leather-like. Despite the layer of dust that covered it, I could tell that this was an object of obvious age, something from a time far more distant than any other piece I had seen in my years of work. I reached out and touched it. A cold sensation ran through my fingers, but it wasn't just the cold that disturbed me. Something else was in that object. A pulse. as if it were alive. I couldn't shake the feeling that by touching it, something had awakened. It was then that I heard a noise, a faint, almost imperceptible sound coming from some dark corner of the basement. It was the creaking of old wood, as if someone was there. I turned around. My heart began to beat faster, but the room was still empty. The flashlight illuminated the shadows, but there was no sign of life. I decided to pick up the artifact and examine it more closely, unaware that I was making a decision that would change my life forever. The first thing I noticed was an inscription on the base, a series of numbers and symbols that I did not recognize. It wasn't Latin or Greek, but something that was completely foreign to me, a language I had not seen before. As I looked at it more closely, I noticed that the artifact had a mechanism inside, something that looked like a small slot, as if it were some sort of key or secret lock. At that instant, a rumbling sound from outside brought me out of my thoughts. A clap of thunder, so loud that the walls of the museum shook. The storm seemed to have raged even more fiercely, and for a moment I felt as if the building was about to give way. But it was too late to turn back. I had already touched the artifact. I had already triggered something. I rushed out of the basement, the artifact in my hands, and up the stairs with a sense of urgency I couldn't explain. The atmosphere in the museum had changed. The air was no longer just heavy, but also dense, charged with a palpable tension. When I returned to my office, I left the artifact on the desk and sat down to try to calm my mind, but something told me I had done something irreversible. That night, the storm did not let up. The hours seemed to drag on, and despite my tiredness, I found it impossible to sleep. It was not the storm that kept me awake, but a strange feeling of being watched, as if someone or something was lurking. I got up several times to check the windows to make sure I was alone, but the feeling persisted. It was the next day, when I arrived at the museum early, that I realized something else had happened. The news was everywhere. A robbery at a local bureau de change, a number of high-grade counterfeit bills circulating around town. The police were investigating, but the authorities had no leads. Something didn't add up. The artifact, the slot in its base. What I struggled to understand was that the slot was not for a key, but for cutting bills. Counterfeit bills. At first, I didn't understand how it could be related. The artifact was nothing more than a piece of antique metal, a piece that didn't belong in any of the museum's official collections. But how did that fit in with the robbery? What did it have to do with me? Days later, the police began questioning various museum employees. Not directly at me, but I could already see the shadow of doubt looming over my life. I knew that sooner or later it would come to me. The city, that small enclosed place, was beginning to speak. There was something that didn't fit, and the pieces were starting to come together. The storm did not cease, but my anguish intensified. Every day I felt more haunted, more trapped, not only by the police investigation, but also by the sense that something far more sinister was involved. I found myself checking the artifact over and over again, looking for some clue, some logical explanation. But there was none, and when I tried to get rid of it, I could not. Something prevented me from doing so. Finally, I understood that this object not only had a purpose, but that it was the catalyst for something much bigger. A mafia group hidden in the shadows of this small town had been using that artifact for years to manufacture high-quality counterfeit bills, and I had unwittingly become part of their story. A mistake I could not correct. As the weeks went by, I realized that the situation was becoming dangerous. The police watched me. There were strange individuals following me around the city, watching me from afar. My family, my wife and children, became an easy target. I couldn't drag them into all this. So I made a decision. To flee. The storm is still the only thing that accompanies me. The constant sound that never ceases. And though I am no longer in that museum, though I am no longer the curator, the shadows of what I discovered continue to haunt me. There is no escape from what one triggers, if only out of curiosity. And now as I run with my family far away and my name on police lists, I know that the real terror comes not from the unknown. Sometimes I think of everything I lost. The museum, my job, my identity, and the peace I once had. The worst of it all, however, is not that I lost those things. The worst thing is that I couldn't see what was right in front of my eyes until it was too late. Someone once warned me that history has its own mechanisms and that when you decide to alter it, you can do much more than change the past. You can unleash a future you can't control. If only I had left that artifact where I found it. If only I had closed that door without looking back. That at some point in some way we are all destined to face the consequences of our own decisions. Fear is not always something that haunts us from the shadows. Sometimes fear is a decision. It is a step we take without knowing where it will lead, a curiosity we cannot control. And even if we try to run away from the consequences, we can't always. The storm may seem eternal, but what really lasts is the echo of our actions. I'm Luis Guillermo, ambulance driver. It's not a job for everyone, not because it's dangerous, but because you never know what you're going to find. What can happen in one night, nor how close you are to the line that separates life from death. My shifts are always at night, and I spend long hours in the shadows of the city, walking the deserted streets, picking up the wounded, looking for the next call. It's not an easy job, not even for the weak. Those of us who do it because there's no other choice, because it's what we know how to do. But that night, everything changed. It was an ordinary night, until the sky began to darken in an unusual way. The clouds quickly gathered into a thick blanket that covered the horizon, as if something sinister was brewing. It wasn't raining yet, but the air was heavy, as if the world was about to explode. As I made my way through the deserted streets, lit only by the flashing traffic lights and ambulance headlights, a strange feeling came over me. It wasn't fear, but an inexplicable uneasiness, as if something was wrong, as if someone was watching me. The first call came over the radio, interrupting my thoughts. Accident on 14th Street, serious injuries. We need your help, Luis. The tone of the voice was familiar, but at the same time unusual. Something about the way he whispered, as if he was hiding, struck me as odd. It was not a normal voice, like the other emergency calls. The address was in a neighborhood south of the city, a place many avoid, a decaying neighborhood where the houses are old and the streets are often deserted. But I had no choice. My job was to go, no questions asked. The rain began to fall heavily as I approached the area. Every kilometer seemed longer and the storm only intensified. I thought it was all a coincidence, that I was being paranoid, but a strange feeling kept running through me. As I reached 14th Street, I came upon a house that looked abandoned. It was an old red brick building worn down by the passage of time, with broken windows and a garden full of weeds. I parked in front of the house and got out of the vehicle. The rain soaked me instantly, but I didn't stop. Something told me I had to go inside, despite the strangeness of the place. I approached the door, which opened with a creak that echoed in the stillness of the night. Inside, everything was dark, except for a dim light coming from the living room. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Just a broken chair in the center of the room and a table covered with old papers. There were no signs of injuries or victims. No one seemed to be there. Still, something was not right. I felt a pressure in my chest, as if I was being watched. I searched the entire house but found nothing to warrant the call. Everything seemed calm, although a strange feeling told me I should leave quickly. I left the house and went back to the ambulance. As I was about to start up, a new call interrupted my thoughts. Multiple accident on Highway 55, overturned vehicle, 2 serious victims. I need your help, Luis. The same voice, the same whisper, but this time, it seemed to come from farther away. A shiver ran through my body. The direction seemed strange to me, but I couldn't question the call. I sped up and headed toward Highway 55. The drive was longer than I expected. The rain was pounding the windshield hard, reducing visibility to a few feet. The road seemed deserted and the air was thick, almost unbreathable. When I arrived at the indicated spot, I found no accidents. There were no overturned vehicles or signs of casualties. Just an empty and deserted road with an open field on one side. I looked at the GPS, which still marked the same location, but something inside me told me that all this made no sense. I decided to stay there for a few minutes. The radio was silent, and the steady sound of the rain seemed to get heavier. It was then that I noticed something in the distance. A figure. In the distance, at the edge of the field, there was something moving. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but when I looked more closely, I saw that it wasn't a tree or a shadow moving in the wind. It was a human figure, motionless, watching. Without thinking too much about it, I decided to approach. I accelerated the vehicle and headed towards the field. The closer I got, the sharper the figure became, but when I reached the place where I had seen it, it was gone. The field was empty. No one was there. The feeling of dread in my chest increased. I looked at the GPS again, which still showed the same place. A cold sweat began to break out on my back. Something was not right. I felt that someone or something was guiding me, but I didn't know what. I decided to leave, but at that moment my phone vibrated. It was another alert message. Emergency in apartment 17B. People trapped. Need you to respond quickly. Something inside me told me I had to go there. Despite the fear that was beginning to take hold of me, I started up and drove into the neighborhood, a place even more secluded and dark. I arrived at the apartment building, and as in the previous house, everything seemed strange. The hall was empty, lifeless. The air was heavy, as if something had happened there, but I couldn't identify what. I went up the stairs to the 17th floor. The door to apartment 17B was ajar. I didn't know what to expect, but the bad feeling turned into a need to know what was going on. I went inside. What I saw inside chilled my blood. There were no people trapped, no injuries, just a series of photographs strewn across the floor. Images of dark and desolate places taken in the same city I had been in all my life. In each of them, there was a figure looming in the shadows, watching, but never clearly. The feeling of being watched intensified. Who had taken those pictures? Why did I feel so uneasy? Why did those pictures give me the feeling that they were looking at me? Suddenly, a thud echoed from inside one of the apartments. My heart stopped for a moment. I approached the door. My breathing became erratic. As I was about to open it, the ambulance radio burst into static and went completely dead. The silence was absolute. Only the sound of the storm outside could be heard. Trembling, I pushed open the door and stepped inside. Inside, there was no one. But on the floor, there were several plastic bags. I approached, my heart pounding in my chest. When I saw what was inside, I felt everything crumbling around me. Human remains, fragments of bodies. But the most disturbing thing was that each bag had my name written on it in blood. My stomach turned over. The photos, the calls, the storm, it was all starting to fit. The victims, the addresses, the whisper on the radio. I wasn't there to help. I was the target. Fear turned to dread when I felt a presence behind me. Something moved in the shadows, and before I could react, something invisible wrapped around my neck, as if invisible hands were squeezing me. I couldn't breathe. I could not move. Only desperation gave me the strength to turn and run. I ran down the stairs, stumbling on the steps, the sound of footsteps behind me getting closer and closer. I didn't look back. I just ran, thinking of nothing else. When I finally reached the ambulance, the storm hadn't stopped. I started the engine and took off at full speed, aimlessly. My mind was in chaos. What had just happened? What did it all mean? But at that moment, the phone rang again. A new incoming call from the same voice. The whisper that had been guiding me all night. Before I could answer, the call was cut off. A shiver ran down my spine. In that instant, I understood. The calls were not to help me. It was no accident. I was part of a macabre game. A game where the roles of rescuer and victim are blurred, and everyone ends up losing. The storm was not the threat. The real threat was the mind that had manipulated me, and that had probably never stopped being there, watching me. Now, the question that haunts me is not how to escape, but whether I really escaped. Because maybe I never did. The rain is always there, like the darkness that lurks behind the people we think we know. Sometimes what is most disturbing is not what we observe, but what we fail to understand. The rain pounded furiously on the roof of the ambulance, creating a chaotic symphony that seemed to try to swallow everything in its path. The rumbling of the thunder mixed with the roar of the water and the constant sound of the engine, as if the storm itself was struggling to overflow the metal capsule in which we were trapped. The darkness of the night, reinforced by the storm, took over the landscape, creating a feeling of emptiness that became even more oppressive. It was not a good day. It had not been a good day since I received the warning. It was 1:30 in the morning when, right in the middle of an urgent surgery at the hospital, my phone rang. My face sweaty and my body exhausted from the effort, I answered the call without thinking. The voice on the other end of the phone spoke fast, as if every word was laden with an anguish that pressed me. "Juan," the man said, You have to come quickly. It's serious. Serious? I repeated uncomprehendingly as my hands continued their work in the operating room. The urgency of his tone left no room for questions, but then he mentioned something that froze my blood. The place, and above all the name, his name, Juan, my brother. 25 years had passed since his disappearance, a dark time in which my life had taken a turn that I never fully understood. The case of his disappearance was one more case that went to oblivion in the endless list of unsolved events. The police never managed to solve anything, and my mother, broken with grief, never stopped waiting for him. I, a child at the time, had learned to live with the emptiness, to cope with the loss, but the image of his disappearance never ceased to haunt me. For all those years, his name, his face became a shadow, a distant echo that only returned in my worst moments, in my lonely nights. But now, there it was, my brother's name floating in the air of the call, as clear as the sound of thunder echoing in the background. My heart skipped a beat, and I knew without a doubt that something terrible was about to happen. My mind, dazed with fatigue, tried to organize my thoughts. Why? Why was his name suddenly appearing in an emergency? My body was still reacting automatically, although my mind seemed to have stopped. As the ambulance sped down the dark road, my memories swirled, and I couldn't stop thinking about that question I didn't want to ask. Do I really want to save him? The ambulance sped forward, the driver maneuvering deftly despite the storm that made visibility difficult. Flashing lights briefly illuminated the shadows on the roadside, creating an even more surreal atmosphere. The air inside was thick, as if the space was charged with a strange energy, as if something in the universe was conspiring to reunite me with my past, in a way I didn't understand. When we arrived at the site, everything happened almost automatically. The scene in front of me was brutal. The man lying on the ground, badly wounded, was no stranger. His face, pale and covered with sweat, showed a deep wound in his side, a hemorrhage that threatened to end his life in a few minutes. In his eyes was a desperate terror, a look that could not escape me. But what struck me most was the scar on his arm, that scar I had seen so many times in my own memories. I could not believe my eyes. The storm lashed harder, and the darkness seemed to swallow us all, but something inside me, a gut instinct, made me realize what was happening. That man was not a stranger, it was him. He was my brother. My mind was in shock, suspended between disbelief and horror. I couldn't understand how this was possible. Where had he been? Why had he disappeared? What had he been doing all this time? Questions that had no answers at that moment. My brother was there, bleeding in front of me, and I, the very one who had grown up with his memory, now had to decide whether or not to save him. I looked at him more closely as I administered an intravenous drip, unable to take my eyes off his face. In his eyes I saw something that chilled me even more. Recognition. There was something about him that told me he knew me, that he knew who I was. Not only that, he seemed to be expecting something from me, as if somehow our lives had been connected even during all that time. The feeling of being watched, of being stalked, hit me hard. That feeling that, despite having lived separate lives, we had never really been far apart. As if there had always been something between us, an invisible line linking us. My hands began to work quickly, not allowing my thoughts to run completely wild. The damage to his side was extensive, and the blood was still flowing as the storm, relentless, continued its fury. There was no time for questions, for doubts. He had to act. As a surgeon, he knew what he had to do, but that night, something else was at stake. The operation, if it could be called that, was not just a medical matter. There was something deeper at stake. The weight of a life that had disappeared and was now, one way or another, in front of me. Anguish washed over me as I went through the operation. I knew I was saving him, but at the same time I felt I was condemning him. Why had he reappeared now? What had he been doing all those years? My mind couldn't stop hypothesizing, but the answers never came. There was only one truth. My brother was there, and I was the only person who could save him. The storm outside seemed to intensify, and the air inside the ambulance grew thicker, heavier. Something was not right. Not just because of the urgency of the situation, but because I felt there was something else at play, something else I couldn't understand. Finally, I finished the operation. I couldn't help but take a deep breath, as if I had relieved myself of a weight I didn't fully understand. I had saved him, yes, but something in me was stirring. What would happen next? How should I handle my brother's presence in my life now? I had done the right thing by saving him, but I couldn't help but feel that something else, something dark, was binding us together. What would have happened if I had decided to let him die there on the ground in the storm? Would it have been the right thing to do? The ambulance continued on its way, through the storm, but my mind kept turning to one thought: the connection. The storm outside was not only a reflection of what was happening outside, but also of what was happening inside me. What had begun as a simple disappearance of my brother had now become a much more complex enigma. What had happened in those years of absence? Why had my brother reappeared so suddenly, and what role was he playing in my life now? More than saving him, I had had to confront my own past, my own demons. The weight of the decision was still present, and the storm, with its fury, didn't seem to want to let me rest. Life sometimes does not offer us clear answers, only questions that keep haunting us. In the end, I understood that people do not always disappear because time erases them. Sometimes we seek them out unconsciously and attract them to us because deep down, we know that the past never disappears completely. The past always comes back in strange and twisted ways, and when it does, it confronts us with ourselves in a way we cannot avoid. At that moment, I understood that the real question was not whether I should save my brother. The question was whether I could live with what I had discovered that night. The external storm was only a reflection of the internal storm inside me. And as the ambulance drove through the rain, my mind kept wondering, who had really disappeared that night 25 years ago? Was it my brother, or was it me? The storm inside me had not yet ended, and I didn't know if it ever would. I don't know how I got here. What started as an ordinary night of work ended up becoming a nightmare that I still feel on my skin, as if the storm that fell that early morning not only wet the earth but also my soul. My name is Edinson Bustamante. I am a paramedic, and I never imagined that my life would be subjected to a dilemma like the one I now face. I don't know if what I am about to tell you is a warning, or simply the echo of a story that should have ended much earlier. It was a stormy night. The rain was beating against the ambulance windows with blinding fury. Darkness had already fallen hours ago, and the city seemed to be plunged into an eerie calm, interrupted only by the intermittent flashes of lightning and the rumble of thunder. The sound of the drops, heavy and continuous, seemed as if the sky was fighting against the earth, trying to drown out any glimmer of hope. The road was deserted, as if the whole world had retreated to the safety of their homes, while we, as always, roamed the streets in search of lives to save. The call had come shortly after midnight, like any other. A traffic accident, a woman trapped in her vehicle. Nothing out of the ordinary. At least that's what I thought as I sped through the city. The storm complicated everything: the reduced visibility, the rapidly forming puddles, the feeling that time itself was slipping by like a shadow, too fast to catch up. When we arrived at the site, I was puzzled. Not because of the accident itself, which seemed to be just another one of those that happened due to recklessness in adverse conditions, but because of something I could not immediately identify. The place was full of vehicles, some with significant damage, but what puzzled me was the presence of a man standing next to a car. His gaze was fixed deep, as if he was waiting for me. He was not an ordinary passerby, nor an alarmed family member. There was something unsettling about his presence, something that made me feel as if everything was a trap, as if he was watching beyond the obvious, scrutinizing my every move. But now was not the time to dwell on that. The woman needed help. With speed and professionalism, we got to work. My partner Juan took charge of stabilization while I concentrated on securing the area. The woman was unconscious, her breathing weak, her body unnaturally contorted. The severity of the accident was evident, and my mind was already calculating the odds of us managing to save her. The man with the fixed gaze, on the other hand, remained in the same place, watching without moving, without taking his eyes off me. It was like a shadow that could not dissipate, a constant feeling of discomfort that I could not shake. The rain increased in intensity, and my concentration became even more important. I was used to emergencies, to the life and death that was part of my day-to-day life, but that night something was not right. Something was moving in the shadows, something I couldn't see but felt getting closer and closer. After stabilizing the woman and preparing her for transport to the hospital, my partner handed me a small crumpled note. I thought perhaps it was something personal to him or some unimportant message. But when I took it in my hands and unfolded it, the feeling that ran through my body was something I could never have anticipated. It simply said, "We are watching you. If you want to save everyone, follow the rules." The sense of danger became palpable. My breathing quickened, my pulse rose. I looked around, searching for the man who had been watching me, but he was gone. However, the feeling that something or someone was watching me, awaiting my next move, lingered in the air. The storm raged around us, but the anguish I felt was not from the weather. There was something much bigger, something lurking in the shadows, and I knew it wasn't a car accident that had led me here. As we drove to the hospital, my mind began to wander, formulating theories and connections. What was happening to me? Who were these men? What did they want from me? The woman we had rescued was still unconscious, and although my mind tried to focus on the present, the note kept echoing in my head. If you want to save everyone, follow the rules. What rules? What did they mean? The men watching me knew something I didn't understand, and though I tried to rationalize it, fear was beginning to grip me. Upon arriving at the hospital, calm seemed to have returned to the world, but inside me all was chaos. The woman was taken to the emergency room, and although the doctors seemed to have everything under control, I couldn't stop thinking about the man with the stare and the words written on that note. I felt trapped, not just by the storm, but by something much darker. I couldn't leave without getting answers. Something told me I had to stay, that I couldn't let this opportunity to find out the truth behind it all pass me by. It was then that my phone rang. The number was private, which only increased my concern. I answered without thinking. The voice on the other end was low, almost imperceptible, but charged with a blood-chilling presence. "We're watching you, Edinson. You have something we want, something very valuable. If you do as we ask, everything will be fine. If you don't, well, you may not be the only person in danger." The call suddenly cut off, leaving me with the echo of those words echoing in my mind. Something they wanted. What could be so valuable in a paramedic who doesn't even have access to government secrets or confidential information? The only answer that came to mind was what I had witnessed that night. Organ trafficking. That's the truth I didn't want to accept. But it had become crystal clear. I had seen what I was not supposed to see. And now the shadow men wanted to silence me. They knew what I had witnessed, what I could have reported, and that made them feel vulnerable. I was trapped. If I reported what I knew, I would lose not only my life, but the lives of many innocent people. If I kept quiet, I would live under their constant threat. I could not win. There was no way out of this without paying a price. And worst of all, no one would believe me. I had no proof, only the shadows around me. For the next few hours, the threats were constant. Anonymous messages, more instructions, more pressure. If I wanted to save myself, I had to collaborate with them. But something inside me rebelled. I could not play along. I knew I was playing with fire, but I could not continue to be their puppet. The storm was still raging outside, relentless. While I thought about the consequences of my every move, I couldn't run away, I couldn't hide. I had made a decision. I would take control of the situation, even if it meant risking my life. I would not let these men get away with this. No one should have the power to manipulate the lives of others as if we were chess pieces on an invisible board. The next morning, the storm subsided. The city awoke as if nothing had happened. I, however, was no longer the same. My decisions that night, my confrontation with the truth, had left scars that would never fade. My soul had changed, and although I had emerged from the storm, I knew that the shadows of that night would continue to haunt me. The lesson I learned is that human beings can be capable of anything when their survival is at stake. Morals, ethics are empty words when we face a threat that can take away everything we have. In these moments, only the strength of our will can save us, even if, at times, that same strength leads us down dark paths from which it is difficult to escape. The decisions we make under pressure are the ones that define our essence. It is easy to judge from afar when we are not trapped in the shadows. There is not always a clear path, and many times, the worst evil is the one we commit against our own humanity. The wind whipped Samuel's face with such force that his eyes could barely stay open. The raindrops fell like cold daggers, cutting his skin with the same indifference with which nature punishes those who venture too far. He had grown accustomed to storms over his years as a ranger. But that night, something was different. The forest he normally knew and understood seemed alive, breathing with a strange energy, an eerie vibration that coursed through the branches of the trees and made their trunks creak more violently than usual. Something in the air felt heavy, tense, as if the forest itself was waiting, lurking. Samuel had spent more than a decade in this national park, walking its trails, protecting its species, and following the natural cycle of life and death in the environment he had sworn to care for. He knew every nook and cranny, every clearing, every animal track, and had learned to understand the forest's whispers, its signals. Yet that night, everything he knew seemed to fall apart. Something was wrong, very wrong. The trees, always so noble and serene, stirred as if they feared something. The wind was not only blowing, it seemed to be screaming, dragging with it the rain that, more than a storm, felt like a punishment. But what disturbed Samuel most was not the fury of the weather, nor even the fear that was born in his chest. It was what he had found a few hours earlier in the cave. The map. An old piece of paper covered with dust and damp stains, rescued from the shadows of a forgotten corner of the forest. It marked a place that did not appear in the official records, a place that in the legends of the village elders was called the Forbidden Forest. No human being was to enter there, least of all a ranger like him. The stories told over generations told of a lost treasure that had been hidden by an ancient tribe. But Samuel was not looking for gold or precious stones. Something much deeper and more primordial had drawn him to the place. The old stories spoke of a forgotten power, a force buried in the very roots of the earth. Samuel had been searching for answers, something that would connect the present with the past, something that could make sense of the history of the place he loved so much. And perhaps, if he could find what the map indicated, he would better understand why this forest had always been a sacred and feared place. However, when he reached the clearing marked on the map, the landscape was not the same as he remembered. The storm had transformed the terrain into a slippery slough, and the roar of the wind prevented his thoughts from remaining coherent. The place was, at first glance, completely desolate. A clearing, covered by a wilted layer of grass, and at its center a huge rock, overgrown with moss and lichen. There was nothing about the place to indicate that anything important could have been there. However, a strange sensation ran through his body, an intuition that pushed him to keep looking. Suddenly, something shiny caught his attention. At first he thought it was just a reflection of the storm, an illusion created by the raindrops falling around him. But no. On the ground, among roots and stones, something metallic had appeared. As she approached, her fingers brushed the object cold and wet. It was a key. A strange key with a design he did not recognize. An ancient and mysterious symbol, one that seemed to come from a past he did not understand. The wind increased in intensity, and once again the air became thick. The storm raged with renewed fury, and the deafening sound of raindrops hitting the ground distracted him for an instant. But then he saw it, a shadow at the edge of the clearing, moving among the trees. Samuel blinked, first thinking it was a play of light or the effect of the storm, but something inside him immediately alerted him. It was no illusion. There was something, or someone, lurking. The sensation of being watched enveloped him tightly. Fear crept like a reptile up his spine, and his breathing quickened. He thought of turning back, of running away, but curiosity, that damned curiosity that had always defined him, made him stay. The shadow moved again, closer this time, and then the wind died down for a moment and the sound of the storm died down, as if the whole forest was holding its breath. With slow, cautious steps, Samuel approached the edge of the clearing. The darkness beyond was thick, almost palpable, and he could see little beyond a few feet. But something moved in that darkness. A man, tall and shrouded in dark robes, stood silently, watching him. Around him, more figures appeared, emerging from the fog like faceless shadows. Samuel didn't need to think hard to know what they were. Poachers, violators of park rules, men who weren't afraid to destroy wildlife for their own greed. Samuel's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just that they were hunting animals in a protected area, they were there for something else, something to do with him. He felt a surge of dread as he realized that he was not alone in that clearing, that it was not he who was watching the hunters, but the hunters were watching him, and not as a simple victim, but as prey. One more piece in a game he did not understand, but which now, it seemed too late to avoid. He tried to back away, but his feet slipped in the mud, betraying his movements. Every time he tried to move away, he felt her eyes digging into him, like invisible claws. Fear enveloped him, growing more and more intense, as his mind desperately tried to find a way out. The key in his pocket seemed to be burning him, an inexplicable connection he could not understand. It was then that the most imposing figure appeared. A burly man with a large caliber rifle in his hands advanced towards him with heavy steps. Samuel knew instantly that this man was the leader. He was a predator, and he now was the prey. His stomach twisted in fear, and his strength left him as he watched all the other hunters slowly surround him. Suddenly, everything became confusing. The hunters were not interested in the lost treasure, the map, or the key. They were there for something much darker, something to do with the forest itself. Samuel understood that he had been lured there, to this cursed place, like a puppet in a game he had not chosen, a victim chosen for reasons he did not understand. At that moment, the truth became clear. It wasn't just the forest that was being hunted. So was he, on a deeper, more existential level. He tried to seek shelter in the shadows, to run, to escape. But the branches crunched under his feet, betraying his escape attempt. A shiver ran down his spine as he realized he could not run. He was trapped, surrounded by the hunters, and with no chance of survival. The wind, the rain, the footsteps in the darkness, everything suddenly ceased. A deadly silence enveloped the forest. He was alone, completely alone, with the awareness that everything that had happened had been a path to this point, to its inevitable end. In that instant, Samuel understood something crucial. The greatest enemy was not the storm or the hunters. It wasn't the shadows of the forest or the creatures that inhabited it. The real enemy was himself, his own curiosity, his need to understand, his desire to discover the forbidden. The forest had lured him with the promise of ancient secrets, but in the end, it offered him only the darkness of his own nature. The hunt was not only external, it was not only against wildlife, but against human instincts themselves, the ones that push us to risk everything for something we can never fully understand. And when we allow ourselves to be consumed by those impulses, we fall into the traps we have often set for ourselves. The forest was not his enemy. The enemy was within him, and the price he would pay for ignoring it would be far higher than any lost treasure.